Sometimes, a life that changes the world begins not with a shout, but with a quiet question spoken almost casually into the morning air. History is full of men who ruled and conquered, yet some of its deepest echoes come from those who simply wondered aloud whether the things everyone believed were truly as they seemed. Before we begin, if calm and thoughtful stories like this bring you comfort, feel free to subscribe and leave a like. It helps these gentle narratives find their way to more listeners who need a quiet moment. Tonight's story is about a man who left behind no books, held no office, and owned almost nothing, yet shaped the minds of centuries that followed. He walked slowly through the sunlit streets of Athens, asking questions that peeled back the layers of certainty from the people he met. His life was simple, almost plain, but the truth he sought carried a weight that would one day seal his fate. This is the quiet story of Socrates, the man who died for truth. The city of Athens woke slowly, as if stretching its limbs beneath the soft weight of dawn. And in those first gentle moments of morning, the air carried a warmth that felt almost ancient, as though it had lived 1,000 lifetimes before touching the skin of anyone who stepped outside. The stones of the narrow streets still held the memory of yesterday's sun, releasing it in faint breaths that mingled with the scent of crushed olives, dust, and distant sea salt drifting in from the harbour. Vendors were only beginning to set out their goods. Baskets of figs still cool from the night, jars of oil that glimmered like captured light, and the first loaves of bread whose steam rose in slow, twisting ribbons. The city had not yet reached its full volume. Instead, a quiet hum pulsed through the agora, a soft and steady heartbeat of people preparing for the day. It was in this fragile hour, before voices sharpened and footsteps quickened, that the Athens of Socrates truly existed. The marble columns of the temples caught the first rays of morning, turning pale gold at their edges, and the shadows they cast were long and gentle, like the fingers of a giant hand resting peacefully across the ground. Birds gathered along the rooftops, their wings barely stirring the warm air as they watched the world wake from its shallow sleep. The clatter of a cart passing over uneven stones echoed between the buildings, not loudly, but with the kind of presence that made even the smallest sound feel part of a larger symphony. This was an Athens that most people moved through without noticing, too focused on the rush of daily errands, debts, families, and duties. Yet for Socrates, these small details were not background. They were the living texture of the world, each fragment holding some quiet truth waiting to be uncovered. At this hour, he often walked alone, not out of purpose, but out of habit, letting his feet guide him along familiar paths that wound through the market and toward the open spaces where conversations tended to gather like dust in the corners of a room. He walked with a slow, almost wandering gait, allowing the morning to unfold around him without hurry. His tunic, worn from years of use, brushed lightly against his legs, and the earth beneath his bare feet felt warm, textured, and alive. People recognized him, of course. They always did. But the glances they cast in his direction were neither reverent nor fearful. They were curious, puzzled, sometimes even amused. To many Athenians, Socrates was simply that strange, thoughtful old man who asked too many questions and seemed strangely content with having almost nothing to his name. Faint dust swirled around ankles and drifted upward in soft clouds whenever someone passed, settling gently on the wooden tables of merchants whose fingers moved with practiced ease as they arranged goods with an eye for catching the early buyers. The air was thick with a calm that felt honest, unpolished, and very human, carrying with it the low murmur of quiet conversations between neighbors who exchanged greetings with the familiarity of people who had lived entire lives within the same narrow streets. From one corner came the crackle of small cooking fires, where metal pans sizzled lightly with the first meals of the day. From another, the rhythmic tapping of a potter shaping clay into something both useful and beautiful. Athens was a city that breathed with all its senses, and in these early hours its breath felt slow and warm, like a creature at peace. Socrates often paused near the edge of the marketplace, letting his gaze drift over the people who moved about with various degrees of focus and distraction. He studied them, not with judgment, but with deep, almost affectionate curiosity, as though each person carried a question they had forgotten how to ask themselves. He watched the way a young apprentice struggled to lift a heavy jar, the way an old woman smoothed the wrinkles of her shawl as if the act itself brought her comfort, the way a group of children played with small stones, imagining them into worlds far bigger than the streets they knew. All these moments, invisible to most, were tiny windows into the nature of the human soul, and Socrates saw them with a clarity that others often mistook for absent-mindedness. The city grew a little louder as the sun climbed higher, though its warmth remained tender, as if brushing the world with the back of its hand. Horses snorted in their harnesses, shaking their manes and sending little clouds of dust into the air. Water sellers called out softly, their voices not yet sharpened by the heat that would come later in the day. The faint sound of waves from the distant harbour seemed to blend with the murmur of the city, creating a gentle pulse that ran through the streets like a steady heartbeat. Every element of the morning fit together with quiet precision, forming a tapestry that felt both ancient and immediate. In this soft and luminous Athens, Socrates breathed deeply, as though the very air carried knowledge. He did not look for grand signs or divine revelations. He sought the truth hidden in the smallest details, in the way light hit the stones, in the way people spoke without thinking, in the way silence lingered between passing strangers. To him, every corner of the city held a hint of wisdom, waiting patiently to be seen. He walked not to reach a destination, but to listen, observe, and remain open to the questions rising within him like warm breaths of wind. A group of young men sometimes greeted him on these morning walks, though they did not always understand why they were drawn to him. Perhaps it was his calmness, or his strange mix of humility and conviction, or simply the way he seemed to see through the surface of things without ever looking down on anyone. They approached him with the unsteady confidence of youth, seeking guidance without wanting to admit it. Socrates welcomed them without ceremony, offering nothing but presence and the gentle, persistent questions that made them think differently about the world they believed they already understood. As the day grew brighter, the warmth spread across the city like a slow tide, filling every street and courtyard with a soft glow. The marble gleamed, the dust lifted, and Athens became a living portrait painted in shades of gold and earth. It was a city full of noise, ambition, beauty, conflict, and dreams. But in the early hours of morning, it felt like a place suspended in time, holding its breath before the rush of life fully descended. And in that suspended moment walked Socrates, unhurried, unremarkable in appearance, yet quietly connected to the heartbeat of everything around him. This was the Athens that shaped him, the Athens he questioned, the Athens he loved enough to die for. A city warm with sunlight, rich with voices, imperfect in 100 small ways, and endlessly worth understanding. Socrates moved through Athens with a kind of deliberate slowness that made him stand out even among people accustomed to the unhurried rhythms of ancient life. There was something unusual about the manner in which he carried himself, not because he tried to draw attention, but because he seemed utterly free from the restless urgency that pulled most people through their days. His steps were steady and unforced, as if each footfall was placed with quiet acceptance of the moment he inhabited. The folds of his worn tunic shifted softly with every movement, brushing against the warm dust of the street and gathering the faint sense of oil, smoke, and the sea breeze. For those who watched him, consciously or not, the impression was always the same. Here walked a man who was entirely present, a man who moved through the world not as a visitor or a laborer, but as someone who believed the meaning of life could be found in the ordinary breath between one moment and the next. He was not handsome, nor did he possess the kind of striking presence that inspired immediate admiration. His face was rugged and strangely shaped, marked by the kind of features sculptors rarely chose for their marble ideals. His nose was broad and slightly flattened, his eyes deep-set and attentive, framed by a forehead lined with creases carved over decades of concentrated thought. His beard, streaked with grey and uneven in length, gave him the look of someone who did not concern himself with appearances, and his hair fell in loose waves that were neither styled nor ignored, simply left to exist as they pleased. And yet, despite this homely exterior, there was an undeniable gentleness in the way he held his gaze, calm, searching, and quietly curious, as if each person he encountered contained some small truth waiting to be understood. Many Athenians regarded him with a mixture of amusement and mild bewilderment. He was a familiar sight, like one of the city's stray dogs that wandered confidently through public spaces, known by everyone yet belonging to no one. His bare feet, calloused from years of walking the city streets, left soft prints in the dust, and though some mocked him for refusing sandals, others saw in his choices a strange kind of freedom. He did not seek wealth, did not chase status, did not dress to fit into any particular class of society. He simply lived, stripped of the worries that consumed most people's minds. And in a world where honor, reputation, and social standing shape the course of every man's life, his indifference to these things seemed almost radical. What drew people to Socrates was not the way he looked, but the way he seemed to listen. He listened with his whole body, head slightly tilted, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady and unblinking. When someone spoke to him, whether a nobleman or a potter's apprentice, he gave them the same patient attention, as if their words were as important to him as the most carefully composed speech. He did not rush to respond, did not attempt to overpower the conversation with cleverness or charm. Instead, he let silence settle like a cushion between sentences, giving thought space to breathe. Many found this unsettling at first. They were used to debates filled with rapid exchanges and sharp retorts. But in the presence of Socrates, people discovered a different kind of dialogue, the kind that revealed things they had not realized they believed until they heard themselves say them aloud. Even his posture conveyed a quiet humility. His shoulders were slightly rounded, not from weakness but from habit, as though he were always leaning a little closer to whoever spoke, making himself smaller so that the truth, rather than his own presence, could fill the space between them. When he stood still, he often rested his hands calmly behind his back, a strange yet natural gesture that made him look more like a thoughtful gardener examining a growing plant than a philosopher examining the nature of the world. The sun, catching the angles of his face, created soft shadows that deepened the impression of contemplation, and his eyes, dark and warm, though sometimes distant, seemed always to be looking inward, even as they studied the world outside. To those who spent time with him, it became clear that Socrates moved slowly, not because he was old or tired, but because he had learned the art of noticing. He noticed the way a child hesitated before answering a question, the way a merchant's smile stiffened when discussing his prices, the way a young man's pride swelled when he spoke of his achievements. He noticed the shifting colors of the sky, the changing patterns of dust on the stones, the quiet moments when people believed no one was watching. Each detail was like a piece of a puzzle that revealed something about the nature of human beings, and Socrates treated them with a reverence others reserved for temples and statues. For him, a simple gesture or unguarded word was a window into the soul, and he observed them with the same curiosity that a scholar might bring to an ancient text. Despite his plain appearance, he possessed a certain gravity that drew people near without their fully understanding why. It was not the commanding presence of a powerful leader or the magnetic charm of a charismatic poet. Rather, it was the gravitational pull of someone who lived with startling honesty, someone who refused to pretend he knew things he did not, and who questioned even the most basic assumptions with the innocence of a child and the persistence of a craftsman sharpening a blade. People felt safe speaking to him because he never mocked them for their confusion or ignorance. Instead, he invited them to explore their thoughts alongside him, guiding them gently with questions that illuminated contradictions, not to shame them, but to help them understand themselves more deeply. His unhurried way of moving also gave the impression that he existed slightly outside of time, as though the clockwork of Athens, its politics, its rivalries, its bustling economy, operated on a different rhythm from the one that guided him. He moved through the agora as if the noise were merely a distant echo, engaging with people without being swept away by their anxieties. Even when confronted with anger or dismissal, he remained calm, occasionally tilting his head with a slight, almost amused curiosity, as though the intensity of others' emotions revealed more about them than their words ever could. And in a world where quick tempers and heated debates were common, his quiet presence felt almost like a balm, softening the edges of conversations that might otherwise have erupted into conflict. Socrates seemed to embody a paradox. He was deeply connected to the city, yet at the same time entirely independent of it. He belonged to Athens in the way a tree belongs to the earth, not because he sought ownership or identity, but because he had grown within its soil, absorbing its stories, its struggles, and its rhythms into the fabric of his being. People often wondered why he chose to live as he did, without wealth or status, but Socrates never expressed dissatisfaction with his life. In his simplicity, there was a quiet strength that came from knowing that the pursuit of truth required freedom, from greed, from vanity, from the endless striving that consumed others. His appearance, his gait, his silence, his questions, all were part of the same unbroken thread that formed the tapestry of his days. In the end, what made Socrates remarkable was not that he stood apart from the world around him, but that he was able to be fully within it without being controlled by it. His presence reminded people, even if only for a moment, of the possibility of living with intention rather than habit, with openness rather than certainty. He was unhurried, not because he lacked purpose, but because he understood that purpose did not need to shout to make itself known. And so, he walked the warm streets of Athens with a quiet dignity that lingered in the memory of all who crossed his path, a humble figure whose unassuming steps carried the weight of questions that would echo long after his time had passed. The mornings in Athens had a rhythm of their own, a gentle pulse that flowed through the narrow streets before the heat of the day settled in and drew sharper lines between the shadows and the sunlit stone. Socrates knew this rhythm well, for it had woven itself quietly into the pattern of his life over the years. Each dawn found him stepping out into the warm, clean light that spilled over the rooftops like a soft golden cloth, tracing familiar paths through the city, not because he sought any particular destination, but because the act of walking itself seemed to invite clarity. His feet moved with steady ease over the uneven ground, feeling the rise and fall of each stone as though greeting an old companion, while the air carried the faint scent of hearth smoke and the distant brine of the sea drifting in from Piraeus. It was along these paths that Socrates gathered the small fragments of life that nourished his thoughts, observing the world around him with a patient attention that made each journey feel newly alive. He passed by the potter's quarter first, where the day always began earlier than in most other parts of the city. The workers there moved with a quiet determination, shaping clay with hands stained the color of sun-baked earth, their fingers turning the spinning forms into vessels both ordinary and essential. Socrates often paused for a moment, not to interrupt their craft with questions, but simply to watch, appreciating the rhythmic steadiness of their movements. The low hum of their turning wheels blended with the soft clink of drying pottery being set aside, and, for Socrates, there was a kind of truth hidden in this craft. The way something shapeless slowly took form, the way imperfections were smoothed through patience, the way each vessel bore the unmistakable imprint of the hand that made it. He rarely spoke here unless spoken to, yet even in silence he studied the potters with the same curious affection he offered the greatest thinkers of his time. Their work reminded him that knowledge, like clay, required constant shaping, and that the hands which moulded it must remain steady and honest. Leaving the potters behind, he made his way toward the marketplace, where the morning still unfolded at a gentle pace. Merchants arranged olives, lentils, figs, herbs, and small bundles of wool beneath woven awnings that cast soft stripes of shadow over their tables. The murmur of conversation drifted lightly between the stalls, not yet sharpened into the louder calls that would fill the agora by midday. Socrates greeted several of the vendors by name, asking about their families or the harvest with genuine interest. These exchanges were never hurried. He listened with quiet presence, as though each small detail of their lives, an illness, a good season, a son come of age, carried within it a glimpse of the universal. The merchants sometimes joked about his lack of purchases, yet they did so with warmth, for even those who did not understand his strange dedication to conversation respected the calm sincerity with which he approached them. As he moved deeper into the marketplace, Socrates was often drawn into the small, spontaneous gatherings that formed naturally in the open spaces around the central fountain. There, apprentices rubbing sleep from their eyes, older men with weathered hands, and young citizens eager for approval, found themselves pulled into gentle, meandering discussions that began with the simplest observations: a change in the weather, the rising price of grain, a minor decision made by the city's magistrates. Socrates never imposed his presence. Instead, he stepped into these circles as though he were merely another passerby with a quiet curiosity. His questions, when they came, flowed seamlessly from the conversation, allowing others to follow their own thoughts deeper than they expected. He might ask what justice meant in a small matter of trade, or why a particular choice felt right to someone, and in doing so, he encouraged those around him to examine their beliefs as though turning a stone to see its underside. It was in these early morning discussions, amid the warmth of the sun and the gentle laughter of ordinary people, that Socrates felt closest to the heart of Athens. Not the Athens of politics and strategy, but the Athens of individuals trying to understand how to live well. Eventually, he continued his walk toward the quieter edges of the city, where the streets opened into small courtyards and the sounds of daily life softened. Here the scent of pine and fresh earth mingled with the air, carried on breezes that whispered faintly through the branches of olive trees. Socrates often paused beneath their shade, feeling the slight roughness of their bark beneath his fingertips, appreciating the long lives these trees had witnessed. Some had stood for generations, marking the passage of time with slow, deliberate growth, their roots sinking deep into the soil as if listening to the stories held beneath the surface. To Socrates, these trees were silent teachers, embodying the patience and humility he believed were necessary for any genuine search for truth. Standing beneath them, he often let the quiet settle into him, allowing thoughts to rise and fall like waves against the shore. His path eventually curved toward the Pnyx, the rocky hill where assemblies were held, though he rarely climbed to the very top during the early morning. Instead, he lingered at its base, watching the city stretch below him, the sunlight reflecting off the marble surfaces of temples and public buildings. From here, Athens looked both powerful and vulnerable, a city shaped by human ambition, yet always subject to the whims of fate. Socrates often reflected on this as he gazed across its rooftops, how entire generations built and rebuilt, striving for permanence in a world that offered none. He found no bitterness in the thought, only a kind of gentle melancholy that deepened his appreciation for the small moments that made each day meaningful. The voices rising from the agora, the sound of sandals on stone, the laughter of children running through narrow alleys, all of it seemed woven into a fragile tapestry that could unravel at any time, and yet the beauty of it remained. From the Pnyx, Socrates followed a long, winding path that eventually led him toward the gymnasium, where young men exercised and trained in the cool hours before the midday heat. He did not participate in their physical routines, but he often paused to watch them, appreciating the discipline and camaraderie that shaped their movements. The clatter of wooden practice weapons, the thud of feet against packed earth, and the rhythmic breathing of exertion formed a chorus that felt ancient and deeply human. Sometimes the young men greeted him with cheerful respect, calling out his name and inviting him to share a story or a question. Socrates welcomed these moments, for the youth carried within them a spark of curiosity that he found invigorating. Their eagerness to understand the world, combined with their untested certainty, created fertile ground for thoughtful dialogue. And he often left them with a question that lingered in their minds long after he had walked on. By the time Socrates circled back toward the city centre, the sun had risen fully, warming the stones beneath his feet and stirring the city into its fuller rhythm. The agora grew busier, voices louder, and the sense of morning quiet gave way to the vibrant pulse of Athens at work. Yet Socrates carried with him the peace he had gathered from his walk, the silence beneath the olive trees, the steady movements of the potters, the soft greetings of merchants, the thoughtful exchanges with passers-by. These moments formed the foundation of his day, anchoring him with a sense of clarity and purpose that did not depend on wealth, power, or recognition. For Socrates, the morning path was not merely a habit, but a deliberate way of attuning himself to the world, a gentle reminder that wisdom did not reside in grand theories, but in the patient observation of ordinary life. And so, he walked these familiar routes again and again, letting the city speak to him in its quiet morning voice, trusting that the truth he sought was not hidden behind the doors of scholars or the walls of temples, but scattered in small fragments across the paths he walked each day. The rhythm of Socrates' life was woven from rituals so small and unassuming that most people would have overlooked them entirely. Yet for him, these simple patterns formed the quiet scaffolding of each day. They were not routines chosen out of necessity or obligation, but out of a sense that truth revealed itself most clearly when a person allowed the world to unfold at its natural pace. His mornings, though filled with walking and conversation, were anchored by a series of gentle habits that eased him into the deeper stretches of the day. These rituals were not dramatic. There was no ceremony, no preparation, no outward sign that they carried any particular meaning. Yet, time and again, Socrates returned to them as though they offered a subtle alignment, a way of attuning himself to the world with steadiness and clarity. One of the earliest of these rituals was his brief stop near the fountain in the agora, where the cool water flowed softly over smooth stone. The fountain was not remarkable in appearance, yet it possessed a kind of quiet presence that made it a natural gathering place. Socrates often approached it slowly, lowering his hands into the water with a calmness that seemed to erase whatever dust or weight he might have carried from his night's rest. The water ran across his fingers and pooled in his palms before dripping back into the basin in small, shimmering arcs. He did not wash in the way others did, scrubbing vigorously to shake off sleep or soil. Instead, he simply let the water settle into his skin, observing the ripples it formed, the reflections that danced across its surface, and the faint patterns made by sunlight filtering through the moving stream. As he stood there, he sometimes watched strangers approach, their expressions revealing the mood of their morning: worry, hope, fatigue, or anticipation. Though he seldom spoke during this time, his eyes followed the small gestures and hesitations of those around him, noticing the way a man touched his beard while thinking, or how a woman's shoulders relaxed when she heard good news from a friend. These observations became threads he carried into his conversations later in the day, forming the quiet foundation of his insight into human nature. Another quiet ritual lay in the way he paused at certain corners of the city to listen. Athens was full of sound: voices, footsteps, the clatter of carts, the distant murmur of the sea. But Socrates listened not for noise itself, but for the way the sounds blended into patterns. He listened to the rhythm of sandals brushing against stone, the cadence of laughter drifting from open doorways, the low hum of markets beginning to wake. Sometimes he closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the layers of sound to settle into him like overlapping waves. This act of listening was not an escape from the world, but an immersion into it, a way of noticing the harmony within the chaos. In listening so deeply, he trained himself to hear not only the words people spoke, but the tone beneath them, the hesitation behind a claim, the quiet uncertainty in a voice that tried too hard to sound confident. To Socrates, understanding others required more than questions. It required a sensitivity to the subtle music of their lives. A particularly tender ritual involved his interactions with the youngest citizens of Athens, the children who roamed the streets with unfiltered laughter and boundless curiosity. Socrates had an effortless way of drawing near them without disrupting their games, observing the way they negotiated rules, solved disagreements, and created entire worlds from stones and sticks. He sometimes crouched beside them, asking questions that seemed simple but encouraged them to reflect on their actions. Why they chose one child to lead a game, why they declared one pebble more valuable than another, why fairness mattered to them even when no adults were watching. The children often answered with the honesty that only youth could offer, unburdened by expectations or social pressure. Their answers, though unrefined, carried insights that Socrates treasured. In their play, he saw the earliest forms of justice, pride, generosity, and desire, the raw materials of adult life, still unshaped by ambition or fear. The children, in turn, sometimes followed him for a short distance, enchanted by his gentle manner and the way he seemed genuinely fascinated by their thoughts. Their footsteps, pattering behind him, created a fleeting chorus that filled him with quiet warmth. When the sun had risen high enough to soften the morning shadows, Socrates often sought out a small cluster of shade, usually at the edge of a colonnade or beside a modest olive tree. Here he paused not to rest, but to reflect. He had no parchment to write on and rarely carried anything with him, yet his mind worked steadily, organizing the impressions he had gathered since dawn. The shade offered him a brief refuge from the brightness of the city, allowing his thoughts to settle like dust particles, floating gently through a shaft of filtered light. It was during these quiet pauses that he shaped the questions he might ask later. Questions that had no intention of embarrassing or challenging others for the sake of argument, but rather questions that invited people to look inward with sincerity. His reflections were patient and open-ended, mirroring his belief that wisdom was not a possession, but a process, a slow unfolding that required constant humility. In these shaded moments, Socrates seemed almost still, his breathing steady, his gaze directed towards some distant place only he could see. Another ritual that marked his day was his habit of sharing small exchanges with the elderly citizens of Athens, who often sat together near the walls of public buildings, trading stories or resting after short walks. Socrates approached them with a reverence that stood in contrast to the dismissive attitude of many younger men who saw old age only as a decline. He saw instead the layers of experience etched into their faces, the years of decisions, joys, losses, and lessons that had shaped them into who they were. With them, His questions took on a different tone, gentler, more patient, attuned to the rhythms of memory. He listened as they recounted events from decades past, the rise and fall of political leaders, the changes in the city's prosperity, the quiet moments that defined their families. Socrates valued these conversations deeply, for he believed that truth was not found only in brilliant arguments, but also in the steady testimony of lived experience. The elderly, in their own way, held a map of the city's history within them, and Socrates approached this map with the care of a traveler, seeking to understand not only the terrain, but the many paths people took to cross it. His small rituals extended even to the way he observed animals. Stray dogs, so common in Athens, often wandered near him, sensing perhaps his gentle nature. Socrates sometimes stopped to crouch beside them, offering a slow hand for them to sniff, studying their behavior with the same curiosity he applied to human beings. He noted the way they formed bonds, remembered kindness, or approached strangers with hesitation or trust. Their simple, honest reactions reminded him of certain truths about instinct, affection, and fear. Truths that often echoed in human behavior more strongly than people were willing to admit. To Socrates, the divisions between people and animals were not as firm as others believed. Both were creatures of habit, emotion, and desire, shaped by their surroundings and in need of companionship. Observing these animals gave him insight into nature's quiet teachings, which he integrated gently into his thought. These small rituals, scattered throughout his morning, did not exist for show, nor were they designed to mark him as wise or unusual. They were simply the natural expressions of a man who sought to understand the world through patient presence. In the gentle wash of water over his hands, the rhythm of a potter's wheel, the laughter of children, the steady voices of elders, and the trust of a wandering dog, Socrates found the contours of truth. These rituals grounded him, not by fixing him in place, but by anchoring him in the living reality of the city he called home. And as the day stretched on, carrying him into deeper conversations, more difficult questions, and the complex fabric of Athenian life, these small habits remained the quiet compass that shaped his path. The streets of Athens were alive with a constant movement of people. Merchants, artisans, travelers, farmers, magistrates, children, and slaves, all weaving together into a vast, intricate tapestry that shifted with every passing hour. Socrates moved through this living mosaic with a gentle attentiveness, never rushing, never insisting on a direction, allowing the natural flow of the city to decide whom he would meet and what conversations would quietly unfold. The people who crossed his path each morning were not chosen by intention. They simply drifted toward him as naturally as dust collects in sunlit corners. And yet, each encounter, no matter how brief, left some impression on him, a small observation that deepened his understanding of human nature. He believed that truth revealed itself through the lives of ordinary people, and so he let their stories, gestures, and voices fill the spaces of his day, like soft light entering through a doorway left slightly ajar. One of the first groups he often met were the bakers who occupied a narrow street not far from the agora. Their work began before dawn, and by the time Socrates walked past, the warm scent of freshly baked bread drifted through the air like a welcoming breath. The bakers themselves were broad-shouldered, their forearms dusted with flour as if they had dipped their hands in pale smoke, their faces flushed from the heat of their ovens. They greeted Socrates with a familiarity born not of philosophy, but of routine. He had walked past their shop for years, occasionally stopping to chat as they shaped dough or slid wooden paddles into their ovens. Their conversations rarely ventured into the realm of ideas. They spoke instead of the harvest, the cost of grain, the difficulties of keeping apprentices, and the small triumphs of a perfectly risen loaf. Yet Socrates listened as if these topics held truths as valuable as any argument, finding in their simple remarks insights into human diligence, pride, frustration, and the quiet satisfaction that came from creating something essential for the life of the city. A little farther along the street, he often encountered a group of fishermen who had returned from the early hours at sea. Their clothes carried the scent of salt, and their hands were rough with the marks of nets and ropes. They were men who lived at the mercy of the tides and winds, whose fortunes rose and fell with the unpredictable generosity of the sea. Socrates admired their resilience, and though he knew little of fishing, he approached them with genuine curiosity. He asked them how they read the patterns of the water, how they knew when a storm was coming, how they decided where to cast their nets. Their answers were usually brief and practical, but beneath their words, Socrates sensed a deep, unspoken knowledge, an understanding of nature's rhythms, and a humility born from encountering forces beyond one's control. These fishermen, with their weathered faces and straightforward manner, embodied a kind of wisdom that no scroll could convey, and he listened to them with the same attentiveness he offered to the most educated men of Athens. Near the marketplace, he often met craftsmen, cobblers, metalworkers, carpenters, each immersed in their trade with a devotion that shaped their posture and movements. The cobbler, for instance, sat on a low stool outside his small shop, tapping nails into leather with a rhythmic precision that echoed faintly through the street. Socrates would sometimes linger nearby, watching the man bend over his tools, the light from the sun catching on the small metal pieces he worked with. Their conversations were simple, yet revealing. The cobbler spoke of shoes worn thin by long journeys, of sandals made for wealthy clients who cared more for fashion than practicality, and of the satisfaction he felt when repairing something that others had discarded. Socrates admired the man's quiet craftsmanship, seeing in it a reflection of his own method of inquiry. The careful examination of what was worn, the patient mending of what was flawed, the steady pursuit of function over appearance. The marketplace also brought him into contact with merchants whose stalls overflowed with pottery, fabrics, fruits, and spices. Some saw Socrates as harmless entertainment, a peculiar old man who enjoyed meandering questions. Others, however, regarded him with suspicion, fearing that his inquiries might expose truths they preferred to ignore: deceptive prices, unfair trades, or dishonest measures. Yet even these uneasy interactions taught him something about the human soul. He observed the way people guarded their reputations, the way pride swelled in their voices when they spoke of success, the way their expressions softened when speaking of family. It was not the content of their words that fascinated him, but the patterns of emotion beneath them, the flicker of guilt, the spark of ambition, the tremor of insecurity. Socrates believed that every man carried within him a mixture of virtue and flaw, and the marketplace was the perfect stage where these qualities revealed themselves with little disguise. Among the people who crossed his path, none shaped his thoughts more deeply than the young men of the city. Students, sons of noble families, or spirited youths seeking direction. They approached Socrates with a mixture of admiration and impatience, eager to hear his thoughts, yet often frustrated by his refusal to give direct answers. One of these youths might argue passionately about politics, another might boast of physical achievement, while a third sought to impress with eloquent speeches practiced before arriving at the agora. Socrates welcomed them all, but he treated their words with gentle skepticism, prompting them to examine their assumptions, to look beyond the surface of their arguments, to question the certainty they wore like armor. He loved these exchanges, not because they offered him an audience, but because he saw in the young men the raw energy of a generation that could shape the future of Athens. Their questions, fears, and ambitions were the living seeds of the city's destiny, and helping them uncover clarity felt to him like tending to a garden that would bloom long after he was gone. Yet not all who crossed his path did so with goodwill. There were those who disliked Socrates for the same reasons others admired him. Some found his questioning intrusive, a slow and uncomfortable peeling away of their carefully constructed beliefs. They saw him as a disturber of peace, a man who undermined tradition, a threat to the authority of those who preferred certainty to examination. These individuals walked past him with cold eyes, avoiding his presence as if it unsettled the ground beneath them. Socrates never took offense. He understood that truth was often unwelcome, especially to those whose power depended on unquestioned acceptance. Their reactions, too, taught him something, for he believed that hostility was not a sign of clarity, but of vulnerability disguised as strength. There were also slaves who moved through the streets unnoticed by most Athenians, carrying amphorae of water, bundles of wood, or baskets of goods. Socrates saw them not as commodities, but as human beings whose lives, though restricted, contained as much complexity and dignity as any citizen's. He sometimes exchanged a quiet word with them, asking about their journeys, their families, or their memories of the places they were taken from. These conversations were brief, for they could not linger, yet they left lasting impressions on him. He learned from them about suffering, resilience, and the subtle forms of hope that people carried even when the world denied them freedom. To Socrates, their voices were as essential to understanding the city as those of the free, for the truth of a society could not be seen solely through its highest positions. It had to be understood through its shadows as well. All these people, bakers and fishermen, craftsmen and merchants, elders and children, citizens and slaves, admirers and critics, formed the constellation of lives that illuminated Socrates' path each morning. He did not categorize them by status or wealth. He saw instead their humanity, each life shaped by circumstances, choices, desires, and fears. To him, every person was a doorway to understanding, a fragment of truth waiting to be noticed. As he moved through the warm streets of Athens, these encounters filled him with a sense of connection, not to a city of laws and politics, but to a living world of individuals whose stories, woven together, formed the complex and beautiful fabric of human existence. Socrates possessed a way of asking questions that was unlike anything the people of Athens were accustomed to, a manner so gentle in tone, yet so persistent in spirit, that it disarmed even those who approached him with suspicion. His questions did not arrive as challenges or accusations, nor did they carry the sharpness of an argument seeking victory. Instead, they slipped quietly into conversations, entering through the smallest openings. An offhand comment, a confident claim, a passing observation, and settling there as naturally as a feather drifting into an open window. People often found themselves answering before realizing what had happened, as though the question had not been imposed on them, but had risen from their own thoughts, blooming softly in the space between Socrates' calm voice and their own uncertain reasoning. He asked not to expose or embarrass, but to understand, and in doing so, he created a type of dialogue that felt less like debate and more like a shared exploration through dimly lit hallways of the mind. His approach began with listening, deep, unhurried, attentive listening. When someone spoke to him, Socrates allowed their words to settle in the air, neither rushing to respond nor filling the silence with his own thoughts. That silence, so unusual in a city where men prided themselves on their speeches, was where his questions began. He watched the speaker's face, noting the way pride flickered in the eyes when a strong claim was made, the way doubt softened a sentence that began with confidence, the way a man's hand tightened around his cloak when he sensed that he was venturing into uncertain territory. These subtle signs mattered to Socrates as much as the content of their arguments, for he believed that truth was hidden not only in words, but in the small tensions and hesitations that revealed the soul's deeper struggles. When he finally asked a question, it often seemed deceptively simple. He might begin with something as light as, "What do you mean by that?" Or, "Is that always true?" Or even, "How did you come to believe this?" These questions carried no accusation, but they nudged the speaker gently away from the surface of their assumptions, encouraging them to look inward. Socrates knew that people often held beliefs without examining them, like stones carried so long in a pouch that one forgot they were there at all. His questions acted as a soft invitation to empty the pouch and truly look at each stone, turning it over in the light to see whether it was as solid as one believed. The process was slow, patient, and deeply human. For many Athenians, especially the young men who admired him, this gentle method felt strangely liberating. They were accustomed to thinking of knowledge as something to be acquired through lectures or inherited from tradition. But Socrates showed them that understanding was not something given by another. It was something uncovered within themselves. His questions did not provide answers. They revealed pathways. They encouraged a person to retrace their steps, to discover where their ideas began, and to see how easily those ideas collapsed when pressed by honest reflection. For some, this experience was exhilarating, a glimpse into the vast landscape of thought that lay beneath the surface of everyday opinions. For others, it was unsettling, a reminder of how fragile their certainties truly were. Yet Socrates never hurried the process. He understood that truth could not be extracted by force. It had to open like a flower, slowly, in its own time. When someone struggled to answer him, he did not press them with impatience. He allowed pauses to stretch, as though the silence itself were a participant in the conversation, offering space for the mind to breathe. These pauses sometimes made his companions uncomfortable, but they also gave birth to clarity. In the quiet, people heard their own thoughts more clearly than in the noisy rush of the agora, and they often found themselves revising their answers, not because Socrates demanded it, but because the truth demanded it. This way of questioning extended beyond intellectual matters. Socrates asked about virtue, courage, justice, friendship, love, and happiness with the same gentle persistence, believing that these were the foundations upon which all human life rested. He wanted to know how people lived, what guided their choices, what they feared, and what they hoped for. When a man claimed to be courageous, Socrates asked him to describe a moment when he acted bravely. When another insisted he knew what justice was, Socrates asked how he would treat an enemy or a friend who had wronged him. His questions peeled back layers of assumption, revealing contradictions that people did not know they carried. And yet, even when he uncovered these contradictions, he did so without mockery or triumph. He simply invited the person to consider what the inconsistency revealed, to follow the thread of their belief deeper into themselves. Some found this process deeply uncomfortable. Politicians, proud orators, wealthy men, and those who depended on the illusion of knowledge often bristled under his questions. They accused him of twisting words, of being evasive, of undermining the traditions that held the city together. For them, his questions felt like a threat, not because Socrates was hostile, but because he was honest. To such men, certainty was a shield, and Socrates' questions loosened the straps that held that shield in place. They feared what might be exposed if they allowed his method to unfold fully. Socrates understood their discomfort, but did not take it personally. He believed that genuine examination required courage, the courage to face one's own ignorance, and he knew that not everyone possessed that courage. Some avoided him, others argued with him, and a few despised him, but even their reactions revealed truths he valued. For Socrates, asking questions was not merely a method, it was a way of living. He believed that a life without examination was not a life fully lived, and his commitment to this belief shaped every conversation he had. He saw himself not as a teacher imparting knowledge, but as a midwife helping others give birth to their own understanding. This metaphor, one he often used, reflected his humility. He did not claim to know the answers, only to recognize when someone else was close to discovering their own. He guided, nudged, encouraged, and illuminated, never seeking glory or authority. In a society that admired clever rhetoric and persuasive speeches, Socrates stood apart as someone who valued truth over victory, clarity over pride, and the slow unfolding of understanding over the fleeting satisfaction of winning an argument. People often remembered the feeling of speaking with him long after the conversation ended. They remembered the way their assumptions loosened like knots beneath gentle fingers, the way their thoughts shifted and rearranged themselves in quiet moments later that evening, the way his presence lingered like the soft glow of lamplight long after one left his company. His questions, simple as they seemed, continued to echo in their minds, inviting them to examine their choices, their beliefs, and the way they moved through the world. And so, through this patient, tender method of inquiry, Socrates shaped not only the minds of individuals, but the spirit of Athens itself. His questions drifted through the city like a warm breeze, touching merchants and craftsmen, youths and elders, citizens and slaves. Some embraced the breeze, letting it cool their heated thoughts. Others braced against it, fearing the chill of uncertainty. But whether welcomed or resisted, his questions became part of the life of the city, a subtle force that nudged Athens toward deeper reflection. This was the essence of Socrates' way, not the force of answers, but the quiet power of questions. The young men who gathered around Socrates did so without ceremony, drifting toward him as naturally as shadows gather beneath the branches of an olive tree. They came not because he recruited them or promised them wisdom, but because something in his calm presence drew them in, a sense that he saw them more clearly than they saw themselves. In a city filled with teachers who advertised their knowledge, Socrates stood apart as someone who refused to lecture, refused to claim expertise, and refused to present himself as a master of anything except honest questioning. This humility fascinated the youth, especially those who felt the restless stirrings of ambition or the gentle ache of uncertainty. They sensed in Socrates a man who treated their thoughts as living things worth exploring, not trivial impulses to be dismissed. And so they followed him, curious, eager, sometimes impatient, forming small clusters around him as he walked through the sunlit streets of Athens. Plato was often among them, a soft-spoken young man with thoughtful eyes and a tendency to observe before speaking. He listened carefully to the conversations that unfolded around Socrates, absorbing the rhythm of his questions, the gentle persistence with which he guided others toward clarity. Plato admired not only Socrates' intellect, but his quiet courage, the courage to say, "I do not know," in a world where knowledge was currency, honor, and power. To Plato, these morning walks felt like stepping into a realm where the mind could breathe freely, where one's uncertainty was not a weakness, but a doorway to deeper understanding. He sometimes walked slightly behind Socrates, watching the way the older man engaged with fishermen, merchants, or children, noticing how his questions changed tone depending on whom he spoke to. These observations shaped Plato's own habits of thought, planting seeds that would one day grow into ideas that reached far beyond the city they wandered together. Another frequent companion was Crito, older than Plato and more practical in temperament. He admired Socrates deeply, but often worried for his safety, his comfort, his disregard for material needs. Crito approached philosophy not as a grand adventure, but as a quiet responsibility, something that ought to help one live wisely and with dignity. He sometimes carried small pieces of fruit or bread in his tunic, pressing them into Socrates' hands when he sensed the older man had gone too long without eating. Socrates accepted these gifts without resistance or gratitude too large to embarrass the giver. He simply smiled softly, as though kindness was something to be acknowledged with presence rather than praise. Crito's companionship brought a sense of grounding to the group. When debates between the younger men grew too heated, he would gently remind them that the purpose of conversation was not victory, but understanding. In this way, he mirrored Socrates' own spirit, offering subtle stability to the younger students who sometimes mistook excitement for insight. Alcibiades was a different presence entirely, brilliant, proud, beautiful in the way youth is beautiful when it has not yet been tested by loss. His charisma preceded him, drawing admiration from some, envy from others, and concern from those who feared his restless ambition. He and Socrates shared a complicated bond, for Alcibiades admired the older man's intellect and integrity, but struggled to reconcile this admiration with his own desire for fame and influence. When he joined the group, conversations often took on a sharper edge, for his confidence demanded challenge and his pride resisted it. And yet, Socrates treated him with the same gentle persistence he offered to all his companions, asking questions that nudged him towards self-awareness. At times, Alcibiades bristled under this scrutiny, his frustration revealing the internal conflict between who he was and who he wished to become. Still, he returned again and again, drawn by the rare feeling of being seen not for his beauty or potential, but for his soul. The gatherings of these young men, Plato's quiet thoughtfulness, Crito's steady kindness, Alcibiades' fiery brilliance, created a kind of moving sanctuary around Socrates. They walked with him through shaded colonnades, across the bustling agora, and along dusty roads that led toward the outskirts of the city, discussing everything from the nature of justice to the meaning of friendship. But not all their conversations were philosophical. There were moments of laughter, of teasing, of light-hearted stories about family, festivals, or childhood adventures. Socrates encouraged these moments just as warmly as he encouraged the deeper dialogues, for he believed that understanding a person required seeing the full tapestry of their life, not just the threads of their intellect. When the young men grew too serious, he sometimes reminded them that wisdom included recognizing the beauty of simple joys, the sound of a lyre in the distance, the sweetness of ripe figs, the comfort of walking beside a friend with no urgency in one's steps. Their gatherings often took place beneath the branches of olive trees near the gymnasium, where the sunlight filtered through the leaves in shifting patterns that danced across the ground. The shade offered relief from the rising heat, and the earth beneath the trees held a coolness that invited rest. Socrates would sit with his legs folded beneath him, leaning slightly forward as he listened to his companions wrestle with ideas. The young men arranged themselves around him in loose circles, sometimes reclining on their elbows, sometimes pacing as they spoke. A soft breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying with it the distant sounds of training from the gymnasium, shouts, footsteps, and the faint clatter of wooden practice weapons. These sounds blended with their conversation, forming a quiet symphony that wrapped their debates in a sense of living reality. For Socrates, philosophy was never a matter of escaping the world, but of engaging with it fully, seeing the patterns of truth woven into the everyday music of life. In these moments, Socrates acted not as a teacher, but as a companion. His questions guided, but his presence reassured. When one of the young men grew frustrated, unable to express a thought clearly, or discovering a contradiction that unsettled him, Socrates' calm steadiness helped ease the tension. He reminded them that confusion was not failure, but a natural part of the search for wisdom. He often compared understanding to the unfolding of a seed planted in the earth. It could not be forced open, only nurtured by patience and attention. These metaphors, simple yet profound, lingered in the minds of his companions, shaping their attitudes toward learning long after the morning conversations ended. There were also moments of silence, long, gentle pauses in which the group simply existed together beneath the shade, each lost in thought while the city moved around them. Socrates cherished these silences as much as the dialogues. He believed that the mind sometimes spoke most clearly when the tongue rested, and he allowed space for his companions to feel their thoughts rather than merely articulate them. In these quiet stretches, the young men often found clarity that eluded them in argument. They watched Socrates' face, serene and contemplative, and sensed that wisdom was not a distant peak to be conquered, but a landscape slowly revealed to those willing to walk its winding paths with humility. As the sun climbed higher and the day pressed toward midday, The group gradually dispersed, some to family duties, others to training, still others to their own reflections. Yet each left with something intangible, a lingering question or a softened certainty that accompanied them like a quiet companion. Socrates did not measure his influence by the number of followers he gathered or the praise he received, but by the subtle transformations he sensed in those who walked beside him. And though he never sought disciples, the young men returned again and again, drawn not by promises of knowledge, but by the warm, steady light of his presence. These quiet moments with his young companions formed one of the most tender threads of Socrates' life. In their questions, he found purpose. In their growth, he found hope. And in their company, he found a gentle reminder that truth, like life itself, was best discovered together, step by slow step, beneath the shifting light of an Athenian morning. There was a curious duality in the way the city of Athens regarded Socrates, a quiet tension that shaped nearly every step he took through its sunlit streets. To some, he was a figure of remarkable warmth, a man whose presence seemed to soften the air around him, inviting reflection, honesty, and a kind of gentle courage. These people loved him, not because he dazzled them with eloquence or authority, but because he listened in a way few others ever did. They felt seen by him, understood in the places of their lives where even close friends rarely looked. Yet to others, he represented something unsettling, an unseen force that slipped beneath the dust of their daily thoughts and threatened to disturb the foundations upon which they built their certainty. These people approached him with tight smiles or avoided him altogether, sensing in him a quiet danger, not of violence or rebellion, but of truth unfolding where they did not wish to look. And so, Socrates lived within two contrasting spheres of influence, one shaped by admiration, the other shaped by fear, and both profoundly affected the life he led. Those who loved him did so with a depth of feeling that surprised even themselves. Young men who sought clarity in their studies found in Socrates not a teacher of doctrines, but a companion in the search for meaning. Craftsmen admired the way he respected their trades, valuing their practical wisdom as much as the polished arguments of scholars. Elders appreciated his patience, his willingness to sit beside them and listen to stories others deemed repetitive or irrelevant. Even children responded instinctively to his presence, sensing a kindness that asked nothing of them except to be themselves. These individuals loved Socrates because he did not impose himself on them. His company felt like the warm shade of an olive tree on a hot day, steady, familiar, and quietly comforting. When he walked through the agora, these admirers greeted him with small gestures of affection, a nod, a lingering glance, a brief smile that bloomed like a ray of sunlight across their faces. They trusted him, and their trust carried a softness that shaped their view of the world. To these admirers, Socrates represented something rare in Athens, a man who valued virtue more than reputation, truth more than comfort, humility more than pride. They often found themselves returning home with their minds stirring gently, replaying the quiet questions he had asked them earlier in the day. They reflected on the way he tilted his head when listening, the way he offered no judgments, the way his simple "why" made them reconsider choices they had thought long settled. In his presence, they felt encouraged to become better versions of themselves, not through fear or pressure, but through the quiet invitation of self-examination. For these Athenians, loving Socrates was not a matter of devotion to a leader, but a recognition that he illuminated something beautiful and honest within them. They felt, perhaps without realizing it, that their affection for him was ultimately an affection for the person they became when speaking with him. But just as love gathered around him like a soft breeze, fear clung to his shadow in heavier, more complicated forms. Among politicians, orators, and men of influence, Socrates stirred an unease that few could articulate clearly. His questions, gentle though they were, had a way of slipping into the cracks of their pride, revealing the hollowness behind claims of knowledge or moral superiority. These men built their public personas on confident assertions, on speeches polished to shine before the crowds, on the assumption that authority meant insight. Socrates, with his disarming humility, threatened this carefully constructed image. He asked things they could not answer without exposing their uncertainty, and in doing so, he held up a mirror they did not wish to face. Their fear was not loud or dramatic. It lived quietly beneath their anger, as all true fear does. To them, Socrates was a disturber of order, a man who undermined tradition by encouraging people to think for themselves. Some felt threatened because they mistook his questioning for rebellion. Athens valued harmony, and while debate was celebrated, it was expected to take place within the boundaries of accepted norms. Socrates, however, questioned these norms themselves. He asked why justice should be defined in one way and not another, why authority should belong to certain men and not others, why virtue was assumed but rarely examined. These inquiries made those in power uncomfortable, for they sensed the potential consequences of widespread reflection. They knew that a citizen who examined his beliefs deeply might become less willing to accept the decisions of leaders, less willing to follow traditions unquestioningly, less willing to mistake confidence for wisdom. And so, their fear slowly transformed into hostility, fueled not by reasoned arguments, but by the instinctive reaction of those who sense their influence slipping. There were others who feared him for more personal reasons. Young men from wealthy families, accustomed to praise and flattery, felt exposed under the clarity of his questions. Socrates did not treat them differently from their poorer peers. He did not bow to their status or soften his inquiries to protect their pride. Some found this refreshing, but others felt it to be an affront. They feared the way he saw through their posturing, the way he refused to be impressed by lineage or wealth. To be questioned by Socrates was to encounter oneself honestly, and many sought to avoid this encounter at all costs. They whispered about him to their families, complaining that he corrupted the youth by encouraging them to question authority, to think independently, to value truth over admiration. Among the older citizens, too, there were whispered fears. Some believed that Socrates' questioning weakened the unity of Athens, especially in a period marked by political complexity and the lingering shadows of war. They saw his conversations as seeds of doubt, seeds that might grow into discontent or resistance. Others feared that his influence over the youth would dilute traditional values, pulling the next generation away from the customs that had shaped the city's identity. These fears, though unspoken in polite company, circulated quietly through the public spaces, like dust carried by the warm Athenian wind. And yet, Socrates remained entirely unaware or unconcerned with this mixture of love and fear swirling around him. He moved through Athens with the same calm steps, greeting admirers with gentle warmth and detractors with the same sincerity. He did not seek approval, nor did he defend himself against misunderstanding. He simply lived according to his principles, believing that truth, once seen, could not be unseen. Those who loved him did so because they felt drawn to this authenticity. Those who feared him did so because they sensed the implications of a life lived without compromise. What made this duality more striking was the way it seeped into everyday life. A merchant might greet him warmly, while a politician across the street narrowed his eyes with suspicion. A group of youths might gather eagerly around him, while their fathers quietly debated whether his influence was beneficial or dangerous. Even slaves and foreigners, though outside the formal structure of Athenian society, observed this tension and responded in their own ways, some with cautious respect, others with wary avoidance. Socrates understood, at least in part, that he provoked these contrasting reactions, but he did not allow them to shape his behavior. He believed that the search for truth required openness, vulnerability, and a willingness to unsettle both oneself and others. The love he received did not swell his pride, nor did the fear he provoked weaken his resolve. He walked the line between admiration and hostility with the same quiet composure that defined every aspect of his life. In the end, this duality, the tender affection of some and the quiet fear of others, created the atmosphere in which Socrates lived, taught, questioned, and ultimately faced the consequences of his unwavering pursuit of truth. It was a balance as delicate as the early morning light that fell across the stones of Athens, revealing both beauty and imperfection in equal measure. As the years drifted forward, a subtle unease began to take shape in Athens, an unease that did not announce itself loudly, but crept quietly through the city like a thin layer of dust settling over familiar stones. To a passerby, the city seemed unchanged. The agora still filled with its bustling conversations and merchants' calls. The temples still gleamed in the sunlight. The scent of olive oil and warm bread still drifted along the narrow streets. Yet beneath this daily rhythm, a tension pulsed quietly, an undercurrent of restlessness that even those who could not name its origin felt deep in their bones. It was as though Athens, newly bruised by political turbulence and the long shadow of war, had begun searching for something or someone to hold responsible for its unsettled heart. And in this atmosphere of quiet suspicion, the figure of Socrates, who had once seemed merely peculiar or harmless, began to draw more pointed attention. Athens was a city still healing from the Peloponnesian War. The wounds left by years of conflict had not yet closed, and the memories of suffering lingered in the minds of its citizens like scars beneath fresh skin. Families had lost sons, husbands, and fathers. Farms had been abandoned or burned. Poverty had tightened its grip on many households, while wealth had gathered unevenly in the hands of a few. The once confident stride of the city's democracy had grown uncertain, its leaders wary of dissent, its people suspicious of those who challenged tradition. The assemblies still convened, speeches still soared into the air with practiced eloquence, but beneath this public display of civic unity lay a fragile sense that the city's identity was shifting. Men who had once argued passionately about policy now spoke more softly, weighing each word as though it might carry unexpected consequences. In this fragile environment, Socrates' presence began to feel different to those who held power. His wandering questions, which once seemed like the harmless musings of an eccentric philosopher, now appeared to them as small disruptions in an already weakened social fabric. They feared that his method of encouraging young men to examine their beliefs might erode the values that held the city together. To them, his persistent questioning represented not intellectual curiosity, but potential instability, a subtle force that might loosen the ties binding Athens in a time of growing uncertainty. And though Socrates himself had no political ambitions, the effect of his influence became a subject whispered behind closed doors by men who measured threats not by swords or armies, but by ideas that challenged their authority. Many older citizens remembered the turmoil of recent years with a sense of exhaustion. They wanted peace, predictability, the comfort of returning to old ways without the constant need to question the meaning of justice, virtue, or civic duty. These men had once admired Socrates' presence, finding humor in his unusual habits or insight in his gentle inquiries. But as Athens struggled to regain its footing, they began to see his philosophy as a luxury the city could no longer afford. They preferred leaders who spoke with certainty, who offered answers rather than questions, who reassured rather than unsettled. Socrates, with his soft insistence that wisdom began with acknowledging one's ignorance, offered none of these comforts. His presence reminded them that their doubts could not be buried beneath civic ceremonies or political speeches, and for some, this reminder felt like an unwanted burden. For the younger generation, however, the atmosphere of unease only intensified their interest in Socrates. They were drawn to the clarity he encouraged, eager to distinguish their own thoughts from the expectations placed upon them. But even among the youth, cracks began to form. Some admired him openly, walking beside him and engaging in long discussions beneath the olive trees. Others, influenced by the cautious whispers of their fathers, began to distance themselves, fearing that their association with Socrates might bring trouble. They felt the shifting winds of public opinion, sensed the growing tension in the air, and understood that one's reputation could change quickly in times of unease. Athens, though proud and intelligent, was also a city that sometimes acted on fear, and young citizens learned early to protect themselves from the unpredictable turns of public sentiment. Socrates moved through the city unaware or unconcerned that the ground beneath him was slowly changing. His days remained the same: conversations in the agora, quiet moments beside the fountain, the familiar company of his companions. Yet even he noticed the occasional hard glance from a stranger, or the way some men turned away when he approached. He sensed the atmosphere shifting like a wind that gradually changed direction. Not enough to uproot trees, but enough to rustle their leaves. He did not interpret these signs as warnings, but simply as reflections of the city's troubled state, trusting that truth, if pursued honestly, would guide him through whatever shadows lay ahead. The political landscape of Athens added to this growing tension. The city had recently endured the rule of the 30 tyrants, a harsh oligarchic regime that left deep wounds in its wake. Though democracy had been restored, distrust lingered among the citizens like smoke after a fire. The people feared anything that might lead them back into chaos, and leaders feared anything that might undermine their fragile authority. The name of Socrates became entangled in rumors. He had questioned the wrong people, influenced the wrong youth, been associated with men who later committed troubling deeds. although these connections were thin and often based on misunderstanding. In times of unease, even the faintest shadow could grow into a looming threat. Socrates, unknowingly or perhaps inevitably, became a figure onto whom some projected their anxieties, their frustrations, and their desire for scapegoats. In the public spaces where citizens gathered to discuss politics, concerns about Socrates were rarely spoken outright, but hinted at in sideways glances and half-formed sentences. The youth must be guided, one man might say, meaning something else entirely. Tradition must be preserved, another might insist, watching Socrates from across the agora with narrowed eyes. These coded phrases allowed men to express their discomfort without confronting it directly, creating an atmosphere where suspicion thrived without needing clear justification. Some men worried genuinely about the city's future, believing that Socrates' influence might push the next generation toward too much independence of thought. Others simply found it easier to blame one man for the city's instability rather than face the complex reality of a society still healing from conflict. Meanwhile, in the homes of Athens, conversations about Socrates took on different tones. Mothers warned their sons to be cautious of spending too much time with him, fearing the political consequences more than the philosophical ones. Fathers debated whether his presence strengthened or weakened their sons' characters. Some concluded that he taught them to think too freely, challenging the norms that held families and communities together. Others believed he encouraged introspection and virtue. These debates were signs of a city trying to understand itself again, struggling to reconcile the desire for stability with the need for genuine wisdom. And yet, despite this growing unease, Socrates continued his life as he always had, choosing honesty over convenience, questions over silence, virtue over popularity. He understood that his path was not one of comfort, and though he sensed the currents shifting against him, he did not alter his course. His conversations remained steady, his tone unchanged, his presence consistent. It was not defiance that guided him, but faith in the idea that truth, approached with humility and sincerity, could withstand the forces of misunderstanding that gathered around him. He trusted that those who sought clarity would find it, and that his own integrity would speak more loudly than the suspicions whispered in the streets. Athens, before the trial, was a city caught between its proud past and its uncertain future, a city searching for stability while wrestling with its own doubts. In this fragile moment, Socrates stood as both a symbol of hope and a source of unease, a man whose pursuit of truth illuminated the path for some and cast uncomfortable shadows for others. The tension that surrounded him, quiet at first, continued to grow, shaping the atmosphere in which the final chapter of his life would soon unfold. The day of the trial arrived not with thunder or commotion, but with the same soft warmth that accompanied most mornings in Athens, as though the city itself had no intention of signaling the significance of what was about to unfold. The sun rose gently over the marble rooftops, casting a pale golden light across the agora, where people gathered in slow-moving clusters, their faces turned toward the Heliaia, the great court. The usual morning sounds, the clatter of carts, the murmur of vendors setting out their goods, the distant cry of fishermen returning from the coast, continued unchanged, as if unaware that a man whose questions had shaped an entire generation was about to stand before the judgment of his fellow citizens. To the casual observer, nothing seemed unusual. And yet, Beneath the ordinary rhythm of the city, there lingered a faint tremor, like the quivering of a thread pulled too tightly, felt only by those who paid attention to the subtle shifts in the air. Socrates walked through the familiar streets with the same calm, unhurried steps that had marked every morning of his life. He wore no special garments, no signs of anxiety or defiance. His tunic hung loosely around his shoulders, patched in places, softened by years of wear. His gait was steady, neither slowed by fear nor quickened by urgency. If anything, he appeared almost serene, as though the path to his trial was simply another part of the day's quiet unfolding. Those who saw him pass were struck by this calmness. Some nodded to him with sympathy, others with worry, and a few with hidden satisfaction. But Socrates returned each glance with the same gentle expression, offering a small tilt of his head or a faint, understanding smile. He carried no bitterness within him. He had long accepted that truth, when pursued honestly, often led a person into difficult places. The court itself was already crowded when Socrates arrived. The jurors, hundreds of citizens selected for the day, sat scattered across the benches, murmuring quietly among themselves as they awaited the proceedings. Their robes rustled in the warm breeze, carrying with them the faint scent of the morning's oils and fresh earth. Some men looked curious, others stern, and a few seemed uneasy, aware perhaps that this trial would shape more than the fate of one philosopher. The air vibrated lightly with anticipation, like the taut silence before a performance begins, when everyone senses that something meaningful is about to occur, but does not yet know in what form it will appear. Socrates stepped into this space without hesitation, greeting the jurors with a respectful incline of his head. He noticed the tension in the room, the way people straightened their posture as he approached, as though his mere presence drew their attention inward. He stood not as a criminal nor a rebel, but as a citizen prepared to speak openly and honestly before his peers. His calmness seemed to ripple through the crowd, softening the edges of their unease. But beneath that calmness, an unspoken truth lingered. Athens was not merely judging a man, it was judging the discomfort that truth had brought into its heart. The accusers, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, stood nearby, their expressions a mixture of confidence, anxiety, and determination. They had crafted their accusations carefully, shaping them in ways that would resonate with a city still recovering from political upheaval. They accused Socrates of corrupting the youth, of introducing new gods, of disrespecting the traditional beliefs of Athens. These charges, though vague, carried weight in a society that feared instability. And yet, those who truly knew Socrates found these accusations bewildering. They could not reconcile the gentle man who wandered the streets, asking quiet questions with the figure described by his accusers. A dangerous influence, a corrupter, a man whose ideas threatened the foundations of the city. Socrates listened to the charges without interruption, his gaze steady, his breath slow. He did not frown or shake his head. He simply stood there, absorbing their words, allowing the accusations to unfold in full. His silence was not one of submission, but one of understanding. He recognized that the trial was not born from personal malice alone, but from the larger fears of a city uncertain of its future. When the accusers finished speaking, the murmurs of the crowd rose and fell like the shifting of a restless tide. People leaned toward one another, exchanging thoughts in hushed tones. Some nodded, convinced by the polished rhetoric of the prosecution. Others frowned, unsure what to make of the situation. The atmosphere held a strange combination of curiosity and unease. When Socrates finally stepped forward to speak, the court quieted with surprising ease. His voice, though not loud, carried with clarity, a warm, steady tone that had the effect of making listeners lean in rather than recoil. He did not launch into a defense in the traditional sense. He offered no flattery, no emotional pleas, no calculated arguments designed to sway public opinion. Instead, he spoke with the same straightforward sincerity he brought to his daily conversations. He reminded the jurors that he had never claimed to be wise, that his only pursuit was to question, to examine, to seek clarity in himself and others. He explained his method not as a threat, but as a service, one that encouraged citizens to live with integrity and awareness. He asked why a city would fear examination, why it would distrust a practice that invited its people to think more deeply about justice, virtue, and goodness. He addressed the accusations directly, but without bitterness. To the charge of corrupting the youth, he asked his accusers to show a single example of a young man harmed by his conversations. To the claim of disrespecting the gods, he gently pointed out the contradictions in the accuser's own statements. He spoke calmly, patiently, with the quiet confidence of someone who had lived his entire life honestly. His words did not dazzle the court with dramatic flair. They simply rested in the air like warm light, offering clarity to those willing to receive it. But even as he spoke, Socrates sensed the deeper forces at work in the room. He saw the flicker of fear in the eyes of some jurors, the tension in the shoulders of others. He understood that many had not come seeking truth, but seeking reassurance that the world could be made simple again. They wanted certainty, not questions, stability, not examination, answers, not humility. And in this desire lay the root of their discomfort. Socrates, by his very nature, challenged the illusion that knowledge could be possessed without constant self-reflection. The trial unfolded with a solemn rhythm, marked by periods of quiet argument, soft murmurs, and the warm hum of the Athenian air. As the hours passed, the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting sharper shadows across the stone floor of the court. Socrates remained composed, listening attentively to each speaker, responding with honesty and calmness. Even when he realized that the tide of opinion was turning against him, he did not change his tone or his approach. He believed that virtue did not bend to convenience, that truth must be spoken even when it brought discomfort. He felt no anger toward his accusers, no resentment toward the jurors. He simply accepted that the city, in its unrest, had chosen this path. By the time the arguments concluded and the jurors prepared for their vote, a soft heaviness settled over the gathering, an unspoken awareness that Athens stood on the threshold of a decision that would echo far beyond the walls of the court. Socrates stood quietly among them, neither hopeful nor fearful, simply present. His face, lined with years of thoughtful living, reflected a calm that seemed almost otherworldly, as though he understood a truth the rest of the city had not yet seen. And thus, as Athens held its breath and prepared to cast judgment, the gentle philosopher remained exactly who he had always been, a quiet man before a loud city, steady in his conviction that truth was worth seeking, even in the shadow of uncertainty. In the quiet moments after the jurors cast their votes, while the city waited for the verdict to be read aloud, Socrates stood with a stillness so complete that it seemed almost out of place amidst the shifting unease of the courtroom. The air in the Heliaia had grown heavy, thick with the mingled scents of warm stone, pressed wool, and bodies gathered too closely together. Men shifted in their seats, cleared their throats, folded and refolded their robes, doing anything they could to release the tension tightening around them like a drawn bowstring. Yet amid this restless motion, Socrates remained unchanged, calm, attentive, quietly breathing, as though the chaos swirling around him were nothing more than a mild breeze passing through an olive grove. His serenity unnerved many who watched him. They had expected agitation, anger, or fear. Instead, they found themselves studying a man who seemed paradoxically at ease in the shadow of judgment. His composure did not arise from arrogance or denial. It was a natural extension of the life he had always lived. For Socrates, examination of oneself, of others, of the world, had been the guiding thread through every conversation and every step he had taken along the dusty Athenian streets. He believed deeply that a person who pursued truth with sincerity had nothing to hide, nothing to fear, and nothing to regret. Whatever verdict awaited him, he understood it not as a sudden misfortune, but as the possible culmination of a path he had walked with openness and conviction. Those who looked into his eyes in that moment saw no trace of trembling or doubt. Instead, they saw a softness, as if he were already contemplating something far beyond the walls of the court, something that lifted him gently above the sway of public opinion. A faint murmur rose from the crowd as the magistrates prepared to announce the decision. Socrates listened without leaning forward or narrowing his gaze. He remained fully present, but without the charged anticipation that gripped the others. When the verdict was read, guilty, there was a brief moment in which the world seemed to pause, a suspended silence that dropped like a stone into the center of the gathering. Some men nodded with satisfaction, others looked startled, and a few exhaled as though they had been holding their breath for too long. Those who loved Socrates felt an ache spread through their chest, a mixture of disbelief and helplessness. They searched his face for some sign of pain or protest, but Socrates simply absorbed the judgment with a calm acceptance that unsettled even his accusers. For a moment, the older philosopher closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. When he opened them again, his expression was as serene as the surface of still water. He did not glare at the jurors or cast accusatory glances toward his accusers. Instead, he looked around the court with the quiet attentiveness of a man observing a familiar scene from a slightly different angle. His gaze was steady, reflective, almost tender. It was as though the verdict had not wounded him, but had simply revealed something he had already sensed in the shifting winds of Athens. The city was afraid of uncertainty, of change, of the freedom that came from questioning the foundations of tradition, and in its fear, it sought order in the form of a target. Socrates understood this instinct. He held no bitterness toward it. Human beings, he knew, often sought clarity through actions that later seemed unwise. The second vote, deciding his punishment, was to follow. Once again, murmurs filled the air, rising like dust stirred by restless feet. The jurors shifted in their seats, some already convinced of the appropriate sentence, others torn between sympathy and the desire for stability. Many expected Socrates to plead for leniency, to soften his tone, to appeal to their emotions, or beg for mercy. Yet when he stepped forward to speak, he did something entirely different. He addressed the court with the same unwavering honesty that had guided him through his entire life. He explained that he had never intentionally harmed anyone, that his work had been devoted to encouraging self-examination and virtue, and that if he were to stop questioning, he would no longer be himself. With calm conviction, he told the jurors that the proper reward for his life's work would be a simple honor, perhaps meals in the Prytaneum, as an acknowledgement of service to the city. A ripple of shock swept through the courtroom. Some gasped quietly, others frowned or scoffed. To many, his words sounded audacious, even provocative. To his friends, however, they were pure Socrates, honest, consistent, and incapable of bending truth for the sake of convenience. He was not mocking the court. He was simply refusing to betray the principles he had lived by. He would not offer false remorse or pretend to be someone he was not. The calm dignity of his proposal revealed more about his character than any defense speech could. He viewed his life's work as a service to Athens, even if Athens no longer recognized it. The jurors cast their votes, and the sentence was announced: death by drinking hemlock. Again, a hush fell over the gathering, though this time it felt deeper, heavier, more suffocating. Even some who had voted against him felt a chill pass through them. They had expected him to plead for exile or propose a modest fine, something that would ease their conscience while still affirming the authority of the court. Instead, confronted with a man who would not compromise his integrity, they had judged him harshly. The weight of this realization settled upon many shoulders like an unwelcome burden. Socrates remained unmoved by the pronouncement. His calmness had not faltered. If anything, it seemed to deepen, as though he had stepped into a place of understanding that others could not yet see. His companions, however, felt their hearts twist. Plato, standing in the crowd, watched with a mixture of sorrow and awe. Crito's hands trembled slightly at his sides. Even Alcibiades, though absent that day, would later hear of the philosopher's calmness and feel a sting of regret that he had not stood beside him. Socrates addressed the court one final time. His words were not filled with anger or reproach, but with a quiet, reflective tenderness. He reminded the citizens that harming him would not protect them from self-deception or free them from the responsibility of seeking truth. He urged them to care for their souls more diligently than their wealth or status. A life unexamined, he said gently, is not a life worth living. His tone carried no bitterness, only a firm sincerity, a last offering of wisdom to a city he loved deeply despite its flaws. As he finished speaking, a strange and subtle quiet filled the courtroom. Men who had voted for his death shifted uncomfortably, sensing that they had misjudged him. Others bowed their heads, overcome by the magnitude of what had just occurred. The warm Athenian air felt heavier now, as though the city itself had paused to consider the weight of its decisions. Socrates was led away, still calm, still unhurried, stepping into the next chapter of his life with the same gentle firmness that had carried him through every dawn of his years. His serenity did more to unsettle Athens than any protest could have. In the face of condemnation, he remained fully himself, a quiet man standing before a loud and uncertain city, holding truth with open hands, even as the world tried to close its fingers around him. The prison where Socrates spent his final evening was nothing like the grand buildings of Athens that gleamed with sunlight and carried the scent of olive oil and warmed marble. It was a modest, dimly lit space, carved from rough stone, a place whose purpose was not cruelty, but containment, a quiet pocket of the city where shadows lingered like uninvited guests. The corridor leading into his cell was narrow, the walls cold to the touch, their surfaces worn smooth by the passage of countless hands over the years. The faint smell of dampness hung in the air, mingling with the lingering traces of smoke from the lamps the guards carried earlier in the day. It was a space built for silence, yet that night it held more than silence. It held the weight of a decision the city could not undo. Inside the cell, a small clay lamp burned with a gentle, flickering glow. Its flame danced softly, shifting in quiet patterns, as though trying to understand the man who watched it with such serene attention. The light cast long shadows across the uneven floor, stretching and contracting like a living thing whenever the air stirred. Socrates sat close to the lamp, his back resting against the wall, feeling the cool stone press against his skin. His posture was relaxed, his hands loosely folded in his lap, and his gaze rested not on the closed door, nor on the small window high above him, but on the subtle play of shadows and light. The world outside had become distant, almost abstract, something he could observe without being touched by its turbulence. The evening carried a strange sense of stillness, as though time itself hesitated before moving forward. Socrates felt the weight of the hours, not as dread, but as a gentle presence, like an old friend settling beside him. He had no illusions about what awaited him at dawn, yet there was no bitterness in him, no traces of regret. His thoughts drifted not toward escape or fear, but toward the familiar rhythm of his life, the morning walks through the agora, the laughter of children chasing each other between the stalls, the steady hum of conversations carried by the warm Athenian breeze. He recalled the way sunlight shaped itself around the columns of the temples, the soft murmur of the sea, the smell of bread rising from the bakers' ovens. These memories did not sting. They wrapped around him with a quiet tenderness. He felt gratitude for the life he had lived, not sorrow for the one he was about to leave. The guards spoke softly outside, their voices muffled by the thick walls. Occasionally, their footsteps approached the door and faded again, marking the passing of time like a heartbeat. They were not unkind men. In fact, many felt a quiet respect for Socrates, though they could not understand the full depth of his philosophy. They carried out their duties with a gentle restraint, aware that this prisoner was unlike others, calm, thoughtful, a man who accepted fate with a dignity that made even the harshest commands feel unnecessary. Some guards, passing the door, paused briefly, listening for movement within. When they heard only silence, they walked on with a faint sense of unease, not because they feared Socrates, but because they sensed a profound tranquility in him that they did not know how to interpret. As the shadows deepened, Socrates' companions arrived one by one, allowed briefly into the cell by a guard who looked away as though granting them entry was an act of human decency rather than protocol. Their footsteps carried urgency, and their faces bore the strain of the day, eyes darkened by worry, voices softened by the struggle to remain composed. Plato was not present. He had fallen ill, and though he longed to be there, his absence rested heavily on the group. Instead, it was Crito who arrived first, his expression a delicate balance of grief and determination. He knelt beside Socrates, gripping his hand with a warmth that sought to anchor him to the world he was leaving. Socrates welcomed him with a gentle nod, his eyes brightened by recognition rather than fear. "You are troubled," he said softly, his voice carrying the steady calm that had guided countless conversations. Crito nodded, unable for a moment to speak. The cell felt too small for the depth of emotion he carried, too confined for the questions that pressed at the edges of his mind. "There is still time," he whispered. "We can arrange for your escape. Others have done so. The guards can be persuaded. Please, let us save you." Socrates listened with the same patient attention he had always offered, his expression neither surprised nor reproachful. He placed a steady hand on Crito's arm, grounding him gently. "My friend," he began, "you know why I cannot do that." His voice was soft, but his words carried the firm weight of his principles. He spoke not of laws or fear of punishment, but of the harmony between one's beliefs and one's actions. To flee would be to betray the very truth he had spent his life pursuing. He explained it calmly, as though discussing the most ordinary matter, and though Crito's heart ached, he understood. Socrates had always lived in alignment with the truth he sought. He would not abandon it now, even to save his life. Others joined them. Apollodorus, with tears already welling in his eyes. Simmias and Cebes, their faces marked by the quiet desperation of men trying to understand something that felt unbearably unjust. They spoke with Socrates for hours, their voices mingling with the soft flicker of the lamp, creating an atmosphere that felt almost sacred. They asked him about the soul, about justice, about what awaited him after death. And Socrates, patient and unhurried, answered each question with the same gentle clarity he had always offered. There was no urgency in his tone, no trembling in his hands. His words drifted through the cell like warm currents of air, calming even those whose minds resisted comfort. At times the men felt silent, unable to continue. They stared at the floor, the walls, anywhere except at the man who spoke with such serenity about matters that terrified them. Socrates understood their sadness. He did not dismiss it or attempt to dissolve it with false reassurance. Instead, he allowed it to exist, honoring it as part of the human experience he treasured. When they gathered themselves enough to speak again, he listened as attentively as he always had, responding with reflections that guided their thoughts gently away from fear and toward acceptance. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the quiet sputtering of the lamp as its oil diminished. Shadows grew longer, stretching across the floor in soft, shifting patterns. Occasionally, the faint sound of night insects drifted through the small window above, mingling with the distant hum of the city settling into sleep. This quiet symphony wrapped itself around the cell, creating an atmosphere that felt suspended between worlds, the world of the living, full of noise and urgency, and the world Socrates was about to enter, quiet and unknown. Eventually, the companions fell silent, overwhelmed by the depth of their sorrow. Socrates looked upon them with a gentle affection, understanding that his calmness could not fully ease their pain. But he hoped it might guide them, in time, toward acceptance. When the lamp began to dim, he leaned closer to its fading light, watching the flame flicker and soften. It reminded him of the fragile line between life and death, a line he had spent years contemplating. And in that moment, he felt no fear, only a deep, quiet readiness. As the night deepened, Socrates' companions stayed close, refusing to leave until the guards insisted. They embraced him with trembling hands, whispering words of love, regret, and gratitude. He received each gesture with calm affection, assuring them that his spirit remained steady. When the door finally closed behind them, the cell returned to its quiet solitude. The last embers of the lamp glowed faintly, casting a warm, gentle halo on the philosopher who sat alone for the final hours of his night. Socrates breathed slowly, deeply, embracing the stillness around him. The cold stone, the soft tremor of lamplight, the distant murmur of a sleeping city, all of it felt like a natural prelude to the dawn he would not see. And in that quiet, he waited, not for fear, not for rescue, but for the truth he had spent his life seeking, now approaching with the same calmness that had guided his every step. The final hours before dawn unfolded with a softness that felt almost deliberate, as if the night itself wished to ease Socrates gently through the last steps of his journey. In the quiet of the cell, with only the faint glow of the lamp lingering like the memory of sunlight, Socrates found his thoughts drifting inward, not with urgency or regret, but with the slow, natural rhythm of a man who had spent his entire life examining the world within and without. These thoughts were not rehearsed nor spoken aloud. They rose from the depths of his mind like warm air drifting upward, shaped by decades of questions, conversations, and quiet observations. In this deep stillness, Socrates reflected on the nature of knowledge and ignorance, on the fear of death that haunted so many, on the fragile yet enduring nature of the human soul, and on the quiet meaning of the life he had walked with bare feet upon the stones of Athens. He thought first about knowledge, not the knowledge that filled scrolls or echoed in the speeches of orators, but the kind that grew slowly in a person through the simple act of paying attention. He had long argued that wisdom began with the recognition of one's own ignorance, a truth he had offered to the young and the old alike, often to their frustration. But now, sitting alone in the dim light, he felt this truth settle within him with a clarity stronger than ever. Knowledge, he understood, was not a possession to be held or displayed, but a constant unfolding, a process without end. He had spent his life asking questions, not because he expected to find final answers, but because he believed that the journey of inquiry, humble, patient, honest inquiry, was itself the highest form of human activity. Even now, on the edge of death, he did not believe he had reached the end of that path. His mind felt open, curious, steady, as though he were merely standing on the threshold of another question, waiting quietly beyond the horizon of this life. His thoughts turned gently toward fear, the fear that so often guided the choices of men, shaping their lives more strongly than ambition or desire. He had seen fear in the eyes of the jurors during his trial, a fear that had nothing to do with him personally, but everything to do with the uncertainty his questions awakened in them. He saw fear in the faces of those who avoided him in the agora, in the voices of those who accused him of corrupting the youth, in the quiet whispers that followed him through the streets. And he had seen fear even in the hearts of his companions, though they tried to hide it beneath words of reassurance or forced optimism. Fear, he realized, was the invisible thread that bound together the actions of the city. It explained the trial more clearly than any political argument or philosophical criticism. Athens had feared its own fragility, its own instability, and in that fear, it had sought a sense of control by condemning a man who represented the very act of questioning. Yet Socrates felt no anger toward them. Fear, he knew, was part of the human condition, a natural response to the vast unknown that surrounded every mortal life. He reflected on the soul with the same quiet wonder he had always carried. The body, he knew, was temporary, soft clay shaped for a brief moment by breath and warmth. But the soul, that inner essence that felt, reasoned, remembered, and hoped, seemed to him as steady and enduring as the rhythm of the world itself. He had spent many afternoons beneath the olive trees, speaking with his companions about the immortality of the soul, not out of dogma, but out of sincere contemplation. Now, facing his final moments, he felt no contradiction between his questions and his beliefs. The soul, he thought, did not end with the body. It continued its journey, carrying with it the imprints of its choices, the clarity of its reflections, and the weight of its understanding. Whether the afterlife was a vast, peaceful stillness, or a place where souls continued to inquire, or simply another transformation in a long chain of changes, Socrates embraced it with openness. The unknown did not frighten him, it intrigued him. Death, he realized, was not a thief, but a doorway. He thought also about his companions, the young men who had followed him through the agora, asking questions with bright eyes and restless minds. He remembered Plato sitting quietly at the edge of the group, absorbing every word, not with blind acceptance, but with a thoughtful, searching heart. He remembered Crito's concern, the way he carried small offerings of food in his tunic, as though nurturing Socrates was both a duty and a form of devotion. He remembered Alcibiades' fierce brilliance, illuminated and complicated by pride, longing, and ambition. Socrates felt a tender gratitude for each of them. They had not always understood him, nor he them, but their presence had enriched his life, providing mirrors through which he could see the human soul in all its youthful beauty and contradiction. He hoped that they would continue their search for truth, not as an inheritance from him, but as a responsibility to themselves. He knew that his death would hurt them, but he also believed that the pain would carve space within them for deeper understanding. His thoughts drifted next toward the city itself, the Athens he had loved with all its imperfections. He recalled the sound of sandals against stone, the smell of figs and warm bread, the bright laughter of children running between market stalls, the echoes of debates that filled the public spaces with vibrant energy. He loved the city, not for its democracy, nor its intellectual reputation, nor its wealth, but for its humanity. Athens was beautiful, not because it was perfect, but because it was alive, breathing, changing, stumbling, learning. Even in its fear, even in the injustice of his trial, he saw something deeply human in the city's struggle to navigate uncertainty. He felt no anger, no bitterness, only understanding. Athens, he thought, was like a young student, proud, wounded, full of potential, yet afraid of its own ignorance. He forgave it with ease. As the night deepened, Socrates allowed his thoughts to settle into a gentle, contemplative quiet. The flicker of the lamp cast a warm halo around him, softening the sharp edges of the stone walls, creating an atmosphere that felt almost sacred in its simplicity. He breathed deeply, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, grounding him in the final hours of his life. He felt the weight of his body resting against the wall, the silence of the cell expanding around him like an embrace. Death was not an interruption now. It felt like a natural extension of the path he had walked. The final question, the final lesson, the final moment of clarity. In the stillness, he whispered a thought to himself, a thought not of sorrow, but of quiet gratitude. He had lived a full life, not in the sense of accomplishments or wealth, but in the richness of inquiry, the honesty of his conversations, the warmth of human connection. He had followed truth not as a doctrine, but as a companion. And now, as death approached, he felt ready, not resigned, but ready, as though stepping into another conversation whose questions awaited him just beyond the threshold. The lamp flickered again, its flame shrinking gently, and Socrates leaned back against the stone, allowing his mind to rest in the calm certainty that whatever came next, he would meet it with the same openness and humility that had guided him through every dawn of his earthly life. The dawn crept gently into the prison, not with the triumphant blaze of sunrise, but with the soft, muted light of a city still half asleep, its edges blurred by the lingering coolness of night. A faint glow settled across the stone floor of Socrates' cell, filtering through the small opening high above him, shaping itself around the uneven walls like a visiting guest unsure of where to stand. The sounds of Athens' awakening drifted faintly through the window. Distant footsteps, the soft clatter of pots, the rhythmic sweep of brooms clearing dust from the thresholds of homes. It was a morning like any other, simple and unremarkable, and yet it carried the weight of finality with a quiet solemnity that even the guards, in their practiced indifference, could not ignore. Socrates stirred slowly, not from restless sleep, but from a contemplative stillness. His body felt the chill of the stone beneath him, but his mind remained warm and steady, untroubled by the knowledge of what the day would bring. There was no trace of anxiety in his movements as he adjusted his cloak around his shoulders. Instead, there was a kind of gentle readiness, as though he were preparing not for death, but for another simple walk through the familiar streets of Athens. He stood with the same calm composure that had marked him during the trial, the same quiet dignity that had accompanied him through the years of questioning and reflection. To anyone who saw him at that moment, he appeared not as a condemned man, but as someone stepping into the next natural moment of his life. When the door opened, it did so softly, as though the guards themselves feared disturbing the fragile calm within. The first guard entered hesitantly, carrying a small clay cup in both hands. The hemlock mixture inside was thick and dull in color, its surface unmoving. It had no scent to betray its purpose, no violent appearance that matched its potency. It looked almost ordinary, like any herbal drink given in quiet moments for sleep or pain. Yet its presence filled the cell with a heaviness that pressed gently against the walls, the air, the hearts of those who stood nearby. Behind the guard came Crito, who had been waiting since before dawn for any sign that he might persuade Socrates to change his mind. But one look at the philosopher's steady eyes told him what he already knew. Socrates would not flee, would not hide, would not turn away from the truth he had lived. Crito's face tightened with the effort of holding back tears. The guard glanced at him with a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. He, too, felt the strangeness of the moment, aware that he was not merely fulfilling a duty, but stepping into a scene that would echo far beyond the narrow walls of this small prison. The guard cleared his throat softly, shifting the cup in his hands before speaking. "Socrates," he said gently, his voice carrying a warmth rarely heard in such places, "I want you to know, I am only doing what the city requires. Please do not hold it against me." His words were sincere, touched with an emotion he could not contain. He had seen many prisoners receive their fate with anger or bitterness, but something about this man made the task feel heavier than usual, as though he were participating in something unjust, even if he could not defy the law. Socrates stepped forward with a slow nod, placing a hand briefly on the guard's arm. "My friend," he said softly, "you need not apologize. You are doing your part, just as I do mine. There is no blame in fulfilling one's duty." His voice held a kindness that eased the guard's trembling breath. It was a small moment, but one that revealed the depth of Socrates' understanding, his ability to see the humanity in even the most difficult circumstances. Crito stepped closer, unable to remain silent any longer. "Socrates," he whispered, his voice cracking, "is there nothing more we can do? Nothing at all?" His hands shook as he spoke, and his eyes searched the philosopher's face with desperate hope. "We could still delay. We could still arrange something. You do not have to drink this now." Socrates looked at him with gentle affection, the corners of his eyes softening. "Crito," he said, "the hour has come. You know as well as I do that to run from this would be to run from myself. I have lived according to the truth as I understood it. How could I abandon that now, when it matters most?" His words were not stern, but tender, spoken with a clarity that left no room for argument. Crito bowed his head, tears slipping down his cheeks in quiet surrender. The guard extended the cup towards Socrates, who received it with both hands. His fingers curled around the clay vessel, feeling its cool surface, the slight roughness around the rim, the weight that rested lightly against his palms. For a moment, he looked down at it as though seeing more than the hemlock inside, perhaps the entire journey of his life condensed into this simple, final object. There was no fear in his eyes, only a deep and contemplative peace. He raised the cup slightly, examining the mixture. "Tell me," he asked the guard softly, "what must I do?" The guard, moved by the calmness in Socrates' voice, cleared his throat and replied, "When you drink it, walk around until your legs grow heavy. Then lie down. The poison will do the rest." Socrates nodded thoughtfully, as though receiving instructions for a simple task rather than the passage into death. Without further hesitation, he lifted the cup to his lips and drank. The liquid slid into his mouth with a bitter taste, its heaviness settling onto his tongue before he swallowed. His face did not flinch. There was no struggle in his features. He lowered the cup, handed it quietly back to the guard, and took a gentle breath. For a moment, he stood in silence, as though listening to the soft rhythm of his body, the quiet flow of blood beneath his skin. His companions watched with a mixture of awe and horror. Apollodorus, unable to restrain himself, burst into tears, leaning against the wall as though his legs could no longer support him. Others turned away, choking on the magnitude of the moment. Crito remained near, trembling, his hands clenched so tightly that the knuckles turned pale. But Socrates reached out, placing a warm, reassuring hand upon Crito's shoulder, grounding him gently. "Do not weep for me," he said softly. "If anything, weep for the city that does not yet understand. My path ends here, but yours continues. Walk it with honesty, with courage, with care for your soul." He began to walk slowly around the cell, his steps measured, steady, unhurried. At first his gait was unchanged, but gradually the poison began its quiet work. A heaviness settled into his legs, a numbness rising like a tide. The warmth in his limbs began to fade, replaced by a strange coolness that crept gently upward. Socrates paused, leaning against the wall for balance. He looked at Crito, whose eyes were wide with grief. "It is time," Socrates murmured. Crito helped him lie down gently on the bed of woven reeds in the corner of the cell. Socrates extended his legs calmly, feeling the numbness rise. He observed the sensation with the same curiosity he had brought to every aspect of life, examining even now, in his final moments, the quiet workings of the body. "When my feet no longer feel," he whispered, "you will know the poison has reached my heart." The chill crept slowly upward, and soon he could no longer sense his legs. His breathing remained calm, steady, even as the coldness advanced through his body. His companions gathered around him, some holding his hands, others unable to speak. Socrates met each of their gazes with tenderness, offering them silent reassurance. When the numbness reached his abdomen, he drew a deeper breath and closed his eyes briefly, as though embracing the stillness inside him. "Remember," he said faintly, "to care for your souls, more than anything else." These were among his final words. The cold rose to his chest, and his breathing slowed. His face remained peaceful, serene, illuminated by the last glimmer of lamplight. His hands rested gently upon the linen beneath him, fingers relaxed, as though he was simply slipping into sleep. Moments later, the philosopher who had spent his life seeking truth exhaled softly, and his body grew still. The cell fell silent, not with the heaviness of despair, but with a quiet reverence. The cup lay on the floor, empty. The lamp flickered once, as though acknowledging the passing of a gentle, questioning soul. And in that small, dim room, Socrates met death with the same calmness with which he had lived, openly, thoughtfully, humbly, stepping into the unknown with a heart unafraid. The news of Socrates' death drifted through Athens with a slowness that felt strangely deliberate, as though the city itself were hesitant to accept what had happened within the cold stone walls of the prison. At first, it travelled only among those who had stood closest to him, the companions who had watched the poison climb through his limbs, the guards who had felt an unfamiliar heaviness settle upon them as the philosopher's breath softened into silence, and the few officials who recorded the event in terse, practical notes meant for the city archives. But by the time the first rays of morning sunlight reached the agora, warming the flagstones with their familiar glow, word had begun to spread, like a quiet ripple across a still pond, touching homes, workshops, market stalls, and public squares with a mixture of disbelief, sorrow, and something far harder to name. The city had not witnessed an execution with swords or spectacle. It had not seen a criminal march through the streets, nor heard the cries of a crowd demanding justice. Instead, Athens awoke to the knowledge that a man who had asked nothing of it but honesty and thoughtfulness had departed the world in a dim cell, surrounded by a handful of grieving companions and a cup of bitter hemlock. In the bakeries along the narrow streets leading toward the Acropolis, women kneading dough paused to listen as neighbors whispered the news through open windows. The rhythm of their work slowed, their hands hesitating over the warm, pliant dough as they tried to make sense of what they were hearing. Some remembered Socrates passing by in the early mornings, greeting them with a nod or a simple question about the day's work. Others recalled his gentle curiosity about the nature of skill, asking whether excellence in baking was a matter of technique or virtue, leaving the women puzzled at first and thoughtful long after he walked away. For them, The news did not arrive as a political matter, but as the quiet extinguishing of a familiar presence, a warmth removed from the streets they travelled daily. Among the craftsmen in the agora, potters, weavers, metal workers, the impact was subtler but no less profound. Many of them had spoken with Socrates over the years, encountering him during their breaks or at the end of their workdays. He had asked them questions not to challenge their status or undermine their pride, but to understand how they viewed their craft, their families, their responsibilities. He listened with a depth that few had ever experienced. Some found the news of his death unsettling, wondering how a man so committed to understanding others could be condemned as harmful to the city. They exchanged glances and brief remarks, their hands slowing over their tools as a sense of quiet unease settled among them. Others felt sorrow that they struggled to express, for they knew that something gentle but important had been lost. The youth of Athens, especially those who had gathered around Socrates in the gymnasia and public squares, felt the blow most deeply. Word reached them quickly, carried by messengers who ran with urgency through the colonnades, their voices trembling as they delivered the news. Many of the young men reacted with disbelief, refusing to accept that the philosopher who had guided them so patiently had truly met his end. They gathered in small groups beneath the olive trees where they had so often spoken with him, their faces drawn with grief and confusion. Some wept openly, their tears falling onto the dusty earth. Others sat in stunned silence, their minds wrestling with the injustice of what had occurred. They remembered his voice, his thoughtful questions, the calmness in his eyes when he listened to their half-formed ideas. Now those moments felt unbearably fragile, like treasured objects brushed too quickly from a table. In the wealthier neighborhoods of Athens, reactions were more mixed. Some households greeted the news with quiet satisfaction, believing that the city had acted wisely in removing a man whose influence they considered dangerous. They spoke of stability and tradition, attributing the unrest of recent years to men like Socrates who encouraged the youth to challenge established beliefs. But even in these circles, not everyone shared this sentiment. Some fathers, recalling the thoughtful changes they had witnessed in their sons under Socrates' guidance, felt an unexpected heaviness settle upon them. They wondered privately whether the city had made a grave mistake, whether the death of one humble philosopher might one day be seen as a dark stain on Athens' reputation. The political class, too, felt the impact of the news, though in ways they rarely expressed aloud. Some officials maintained a firm outward composure, insisting that the trial had been necessary to preserve order in a fragile time. But others felt discomfort growing quietly in their hearts as they recalled the calm dignity with which Socrates had spoken in the courtroom. They remembered his refusal to flatter or plead, the gentle clarity with which he explained his devotion to truth. And now, as the reality of his death settled across the city, some felt the first stirrings of doubt in their decisions. Yet these doubts remained locked behind practiced expressions of authority, hidden from the public, but heavy in their private thoughts. As the day progressed, Athens moved with a slower rhythm than usual, as though the city were adjusting to an absence it could not yet fully comprehend. The agora, typically filled with energetic debate and bustling trade, seemed muted. Conversations were shorter, gestures more subdued. Even the cries of merchants felt softer, their voices lacking the usual brightness. People glanced at one another with a kind of shared bewilderment, unsure of how to respond to an event that seemed both intimate and monumental. Some spoke of Socrates as a troublemaker, others as a martyr, but most simply felt the strangeness of the moment, the sense that something essential had shifted beneath the surface of the city. Children, unaware of the philosophical depths of the situation, sensed the change in the adults around them. They played more quietly, their laughter subdued by the tone of the day. Some asked their parents who Socrates was, or why people looked so somber. The answers varied. Some spoke of a wise man unjustly condemned, others of a troublesome thinker whose influence had gone too far. But regardless of how adults explained the event, the children absorbed its emotional weight, sensing that the city they knew had entered a moment of quiet reflection. As evening approached, the glow of the setting sun cast long shadows through the streets, illuminating the city with a gentle, fading warmth. People returned to their homes, carrying the weight of the day's conversations, the unspoken questions, the lingering unease. Families gathered around their tables, sharing bread and olives in silence that felt different from the ordinary quiet of mealtimes. Some stared into the flickering lamplight, thinking of Socrates' final hours and wondering what thoughts had carried him into death. Others spoke softly of the philosopher's teachings, repeating his phrases in attempts to hold on to something of his presence. In the inns and small taverns where travelers and citizens gathered, discussions of Socrates filled the air. Some argued that his death marked the end of an era, others that it signaled a troubling shift in Athens' willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. A few spoke with passionate grief, their voices trembling with admiration for the man they had admired from a distance. But even those who disagreed with his ideas felt a strange quietness settle over them when his name was mentioned. It was as if the city itself were pausing, not in guilt, not in triumph, but in a moment of introspection it could no longer avoid. By nightfall, Athens had grown still. The sky darkened into a deep, star-filled blue, and the lamps flickered in the narrow streets like small beating hearts. The city slept, but not peacefully. Socrates was gone, and Athens, in its own troubled way, felt the absence of a man who had asked it only to look within, to question gently, to seek truth without fear. His death had created a vast, quiet space in the soul of the city, a space that would not close quickly and perhaps would never close at all. In that quiet night, a few people whispered prayers, others whispered regrets, and still others whispered nothing at all, sitting in silence as though listening for a voice that would no longer answer. The ripple of Socrates' final breath spread outward, touching every corner of Athens with a delicate sadness, a lingering question, and the beginning of a legacy that no court, no verdict, no poison could ever contain. In the days that followed Socrates' death, his young companions moved through Athens like shadows torn loose from their source, their steps softened by grief, and their voices weakened by the weight of an absence they did not yet know how to inhabit. They had always walked beside him with the unthinking certainty of youth, believing that the gentle rhythm of his questions would continue to accompany their mornings, their afternoons in the gymnasium, their wandering conversations beneath the trembling leaves of the olive trees. But now the city felt altered in a way that went deeper than the loss of a single man. It felt as if a familiar, steady note in the great hum of Athens had been removed, leaving behind a silence that expanded quietly through the colonnades, the markets, and the shaded places where they once gathered. The young men who had listened to Socrates' questions with both frustration and admiration now found themselves confronting the world without the guiding presence of the man who had taught them, not by giving answers, but by teaching them how to ask. And in that emptiness, something remarkable began to take shape. A shared sense of responsibility, a fragile but growing conviction that the truth he had sought must not dissolve into the air with his final breath. Plato, though young, felt the loss most profoundly. His illness had kept him from the prison on that final morning, a fact that weighed heavily on him, settling into his chest like a stone he could neither swallow nor set aside. In the quiet hours after receiving the news, he wandered through his home in a daze, replaying every conversation he had ever had with Socrates. He remembered the man's gentle humor, his unyielding devotion to seeking clarity, the way he seemed to illuminate even the simplest question by approaching it with calm curiosity. Plato had admired many men in Athens, but none had shaped his mind the way Socrates had. And now, as he sat surrounded by scrolls he could not read, and the familiar hum of the city pressed faintly against the shutters, he felt the stirrings of something that had not been there before, a quiet determination, a resolve forming like a flame kindled by grief. He understood that Socrates had left them not answers, but a method, a way of thinking, a way of living with integrity. And Plato, despite his youth, sensed that this method must be preserved, not out of devotion alone, but out of a deep awareness that Athens, and perhaps the world beyond it, needed voices capable of continuing what Socrates had begun. Crito, older and slower to change, carried the grief in a different way. For him, Socrates had been a friend of many years, a steady presence whose simplicity of life had always grounded his own. Crito had hoped until the very last moment that Socrates might escape, and even after the cup of hemlock had been drained, he found himself haunted by the thought that perhaps, through influence, through courage, through some last desperate attempt, he might have prevented the tragedy. He walked through the city with downcast eyes, unable to shake the feeling that he had failed a friend in his final hour. Yet even within this sorrow, something delicate began to unfold. As he revisited the conversations of the last night, the calmness of Socrates' voice, the gentleness of his explanations, his unwavering devotion to living in harmony with his beliefs, Crito felt the quiet force of those final moments shaping him from within. He began to speak more softly to those around him, asking questions with a mindfulness he had learned at Socrates' side. He encouraged younger men to think for themselves, not in the grand philosophical manner of formal debate, but in the small, everyday choices that defined their lives. Without realizing it, he became a carrier of the same calm integrity that had once defined his friend. Simmias and Cebes, always thoughtful and earnest, took the loss as a challenge to deepen their inquiry into the questions Socrates had left them. They met in long, reflective conversations, sitting beneath the same olive trees where they had once debated alongside him. They recalled Socrates' thoughts on the immortality of the soul, on the nature of virtue, on the quiet responsibility of a life well examined. Their voices often trembled, caught between sorrow and reverence, but they continued to speak, to question, to wrestle with the ideas that had formed the core of their companionship. They understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that Socrates' legacy could not be preserved simply by repeating his words. It had to be carried forward through their own reflections, their own struggles, their own growing clarity. They began writing fragments, small summaries of dialogues they remembered, pieces of his teachings that emerged in moments of unexpected calm. These fragments, humble and incomplete, would one day help shape some of the most enduring philosophical texts of the ancient world. Even Alcibiades, wandering far from Athens, felt the echo of Socrates' death in a way he could neither escape nor fully grasp. Brilliant, restless, and fractured by ambition, he had always resisted Socrates' influence, even as he admired him. But when news reached him of the philosopher's final calmness, the way he accepted death without fear, the way he comforted his weeping companions rather than seeking their comfort, something within him trembled. His life had been marked by pursuit of glory, of power, of recognition. Yet Socrates, in his humility, had lived with a freedom that Alcibiades had never managed to find. In the quiet moments between his travels and conflicts, Alcibiades felt the unsettling presence of Socrates' memory, asking questions not in words, but in the form of a mirror held up to his soul. That mirror revealed contradictions he had long avoided, and for brief moments he allowed himself to wonder what kind of man he might have been had he followed Socrates' path more closely. Though he did not become a philosopher, his life would remain forever touched by the memory of the man who once saw greatness in him that he could not see in himself. Beyond the intimacy of Socrates' companions, the city's youth slowly began to take up fragments of his method. Some practiced asking questions before forming judgments. Others reflected silently on their choices at the end of each day. A few began writing down their thoughts, practicing a form of self-examination they had witnessed in Socrates. These changes were small, barely visible to the wider city, but they carried seeds of something that would grow quietly over time. His influence did not vanish from Athens. It dissolved gently into its people, into their conversations, their decisions, the slow shaping of their characters. And so, in the aftermath of Socrates' death, a quiet transformation began. His companions, Plato with his burgeoning vision, Crito with his gentle integrity, Simmias and Cebes with their earnest inquiry, even Alcibiades with his haunted reflection, became carriers of the flame he had tended all his life. They did not replace him. They did not speak with his voice or walk with his steps. Instead, each became an echo of a different part of him, a living thread woven into the fabric of the city he had loved. Through them, the questions he had asked would continue to unfold, touching the lives of people he would never meet, shaping thoughts centuries beyond the reach of Athens' walls. His companions, in their grief and their growth, became the first custodians of a legacy that no poison could silence, a legacy born not from answers, but from the quiet, unwavering courage to seek the truth with humility and an open heart. In the weeks that followed Socrates' death, the story of his final days began to drift across Athens in quiet, uneven waves, carried not by the cry of heralds or the declarations of officials, but through the soft murmurs of conversations shared in shaded courtyards, at the edges of market stalls, and along the narrow, sun-washed paths where neighbors lingered after errands and trades. At first, the retellings were hesitant, fragmented, woven from half-understood glimpses of truth that clung to the memories of those who had witnessed pieces of the event. But as the days stretched into weeks, something unexpected began to take shape, a gentler, clearer narrative that emerged not from a single voice, but from the collective whisper of a city struggling to reconcile what it had done with the man it had condemned. Some citizens spoke of the calmness he showed when the verdict was read, describing how he stood with the quiet dignity of a man who had spent his life preparing for this very moment, while others recounted the tenderness with which he comforted his companions in the hours before drinking the hemlock. These recollections spread slowly but persistently, shaping an image of Socrates not as a threat to Athens, but as a figure whose serenity unsettled even those who had wished to silence him. And in this slow weaving of stories, a tapestry formed by the hands and voices of people who barely understood the depth of what they were preserving, Athens began, without realizing it, to build the foundations of his legacy. Among the merchants in the agora, the tale took on the shape of memory, softened by time. They recalled seeing him walk the marketplace with bare feet and a thoughtful expression, pausing to speak with anyone bold enough to meet his gaze. They remembered how he questioned the meaning of skill, the purpose of trade, the dignity of labor, and how he treated even the simplest craftsmen with a respect that surprised and disarmed them. Now, as they shared these recollections with one another, they found themselves returning to these conversations with a strange sense of nostalgia, as though they had once stood near a source of light without recognizing its glow. The old fisherman along the Piraeus harbor spoke of him too, telling stories of the philosopher who sometimes wandered the docks, watching the boats come and go with a patient curiosity that made even the most weathered sailors pause. They remembered his questions about the sea, about courage, about the invisible balance between risk and judgment that guided their lives. In their retellings, Socrates became a gentle presence whose absence now lingered like the faint scent of salt carried inland by the breeze, a reminder of something once familiar and now quietly missed. The younger men of Athens, those who had not studied with Socrates directly but had seen him speaking beneath the colonnades or walking slowly through the gymnasium grounds, began sharing stories of him in the same manner that youth everywhere share tales of someone they admire without entirely understanding why. They spoke of his simplicity, his lack of interest in wealth or praise, his strange ability to transform an ordinary conversation into something that stirred the mind long after the words had faded. They repeated the fragments they had overheard, his gentle challenge that a life unexamined is not worth living, his insistence that virtue was more important than success, his quiet belief that injustice harmed the soul of the one who committed it far more than the one who suffered from it. These words circulated among them not as philosophical doctrine, but as impressions, like the outline of a figure glimpsed through fog. And though many misunderstood the full depth of what he meant, they felt the weight of his ideas pressing softly against their thoughts, reshaping them in slow and subtle ways. Even those who had opposed him found themselves returning to his memory with an unease that grew rather than diminished with time. Some of the jurors who had voted for his death began to examine their decision more closely, not with open regret. Athenians rarely admitted such things, but with a discomfort that settled into the quiet corners of their days. They remembered the calmness with which he spoke, the absence of fear in his voice, the thoughtfulness that seemed to shine even in the dim light of the courtroom. The more they reflected on the trial, the more they felt the first faint stirrings of doubt. Had they acted from reason or from fear? Had they protected the city or silenced a voice that revealed uncomfortable truths? These questions lingered, whispering to them in moments of solitude, unsettling the peace they had hoped the execution would restore. In private gatherings across the city, small groups began speaking of Socrates with a tenderness that surprised them. These were not formal assemblies of philosophers, but ordinary households where families shared meals at low wooden tables and lamps flickered in the warm breeze of the open windows. Parents told their children of his gentleness, of how he had refused to flee even when offered the chance, of how he had spoken of virtue even in the face of death. Some spoke of him as an example of courage, others as a reminder that truth often carries a cost that the world is reluctant to pay. In these intimate retellings, Socrates' story began to shift away from the political accusation that had condemned him and moved towards something more human, more enduring. The story of a man who lived with integrity in a world uncertain of its own values. Plato, though still withdrawn in the early days of grief, began quietly collecting recollections from those who had known Socrates. He did not announce his project or speak openly of his intention. Instead, he listened, carefully, patiently, gathering stories like seeds that he knew would one day form the roots of something greater. He wrote small notes and fragments in the margins of wax tablets, preserving details others considered trivial. The exact words Socrates used when calming Apollodorus, the slow rising of numbness in his legs after drinking the hemlock, the final softness of his voice when he urged his friends to care for their souls. These fragments, gentle and incomplete, would one day become part of a body of work that would outlive Athens, outlive its politics, outlive even the memory of those who now whispered the stories. But for the moment, they existed only as quiet seeds, small, fragile, filled with potential. Slowly, subtly, the story of Socrates began to travel beyond Athens, as travelers, merchants, and scholars carried fragments of the tale to other cities. Some spoke of a philosopher unjustly condemned, others of a stubborn man whose ideas had disrupted the delicate balance of the city. Yet even in these conflicting accounts, one thread remained constant. Socrates had faced death with a calmness that defied comprehension. And that calmness, retold in countless variations, became the spark that ensured his memory would not fade into the dust of the agora or the silence of the prison walls. Thus, without intention, without a plan, without a monument or proclamation, the legacy of Socrates began to take root in the hearts and conversations of the people who had once walked past him without noticing the depth of the man in their midst. His story spread quietly, gently, like the first soft breeze that signals the coming change of a season. And in that quiet spread, the first seeds of his legacy were planted, fragile, uncertain, but already alive, already growing in places even he could not have imagined. In the months that followed Socrates' death, something subtle yet extraordinary began to unfold across Athens, and, slowly, far beyond its borders. The man who had once walked barefoot through the agora, asking simple questions, was gradually becoming something larger than the memory of those who had known him. His life, once contained within the narrow streets of the city and the shaded groves where he spoke with friends, began to stretch beyond the boundaries of direct recollection and settle into the quieter, more mysterious territory of myth. This transformation did not happen abruptly, nor did it arise from any single telling of his story. Instead, it grew gradually, like mist gathering over the hills at dawn, thin at first, barely noticeable, then slowly thickening until the outlines of familiar shapes blurred into something more symbolic, more resonant, more enduring. The citizens who shared stories of him did not realize what they were doing. To them, recounting his final calmness or his gentle manner of questioning felt like the natural act of grieving or reflecting on a man whose presence had touched their lives. But each retelling carried a small shift, a subtle deepening of meaning, a soft emphasis on the extraordinary nature of his simplicity. And over time, these small shifts accumulated, shaping Socrates not merely as a philosopher who had lived and died, but as a figure whose entire life seemed to stand for something beyond the reach of any single human story. The merchants who had once spoken to him casually began embellishing their memories without intending to. They recalled his curiosity, his questions, the way he seemed to observe the world with a kind of quiet wonder, and as they spoke, the figure in their recollections softened, becoming almost luminous. They described him pausing at stalls to ask about the price of goods, but now their retellings lingered on his humility, on how he made even simple trades feel like moments of shared insight. Fishermen at the harbour began recalling encounters that may have lasted no more than a few minutes. Yet in their retellings, these brief exchanges carried the weight of lessons or omens, as though Socrates had recognized something in the flow of the tide that others overlooked. In this way, the everyday moments of his life became the threads of a tapestry woven by memory, each thread brightened by the warmth of admiration or softened by the haze of grief. The companions who had known him more intimately felt this shift with greater complexity. Plato, Simmias, and Cebes began to speak of Socrates with a kind of reverence that bordered on awe, not because they intended to elevate him beyond the realm of ordinary men, but because his absence sharpened the significance of everything he had touched. When they spoke of him beneath the olive trees where they still gathered, they found themselves emphasizing the clarity of his thoughts, the purity of his intentions, the remarkable calmness that had shaped even his death. At first, they corrected the embellished stories that circulated through the city, insisting that the truth was simpler and more human. But over time, they realized that the truth itself possessed a beauty that gave rise to myth. For Socrates had lived in such harmony with his principles that even plain facts about him felt like fragments of a larger symbolic narrative. And so, they stopped resisting the embellishments, not out of dishonesty, but out of a quiet recognition that the world needed stories that illuminated the deeper meaning of his life. The youth of Athens, especially those who had admired Socrates from a distance, began shaping their own versions of his legacy. To them, he became the embodiment of intellectual courage, a man who dared to question the unquestioned. Their stories highlighted his debates with sophists, his challenges to established beliefs, his unwavering devotion to truth, even when it led him toward death. They spoke of him in tones usually reserved for legendary heroes, not because he fought battles or conquered lands, but because he walked calmly into his own execution with a serenity that felt otherworldly. This younger generation, restless, impressionable, eager for meaning, found in Socrates a model not of defiance, but of inner strength. And in their retellings, the lines between history and myth began to blur, transforming Socrates into a symbol of the examined life, of the quiet resistance that comes through honest questioning. Even those who had opposed him found themselves caught in the shift. The jurors who had voted for his death began hearing the stories spreading through the city and felt something stir uneasily within them. At first, they dismissed the retellings as exaggerations, attempts to romanticize a man they believed had been dangerous or disruptive. But as the months passed, they heard more and more accounts of his calmness, his gentleness, his lack of bitterness. These stories, told by people who had been present or had heard from those who had, pressed into their minds with increasing insistence. They began to wonder whether the trial had been driven not by justice, but by fear. And though they rarely spoke these doubts aloud, the uncertainty softened their memories of Socrates, blurring the sharpness of their judgment. In this way, even his opponents contributed to his myth, for their private doubts transformed him into a figure whose death revealed something troubling about the city that had condemned him. Beyond Athens, travelers carried fragments of the story to other cities: Corinth, Megara, Thebes. These travelers repeated what they had heard, but in new contexts, the stories began to shift further. People who had never met Socrates, who knew nothing of his mannerisms, his smile, the way he tilted his head while listening, began speaking of him as though he were a figure from an older, deeper tradition. They imagined him standing in the marketplace surrounded by eager students, delivering grand speeches instead of asking simple questions. They pictured him as a martyr of philosophy, a man who died defending the purity of wisdom. And though these images did not reflect the precise reality of his life, they captured something essential about the effect he had on those who remembered him. The sense that he had opened a door for them, inviting them into a way of thinking that felt larger, freer, more honest. Plato watched this transformation with both caution and hope. He feared that the truth of Socrates' method, the gentle questioning, the humility, the refusal to claim knowledge, might dissolve beneath the weight of myth. Yet he also recognized that myth had a power of its own. A story larger than life could reach people who might never have listened to the quiet voice of the real Socrates. And so he began writing, not to preserve Socrates exactly as he had been, but to protect the essence of his thought. In the dialogues Plato would shape, Socrates spoke with clarity, humor, and resilience. These writings, though stylized, would carry the flame of his teacher's legacy far beyond the walls of Athens, ensuring that the myth forming around him would not lose its connection to the truth it sought to embody. Thus, the transformation continued. Socrates, the man, barefoot, humble, calm, became Socrates the symbol, the gentle philosopher whose life and death revealed the beauty of living according to one's deepest convictions. His story, shaped by many voices and softened by time, began to transcend the boundaries of personal memory. It became a legend, not because it ignored the truth, but because it illuminated it, turning one man's quiet search for wisdom into a guiding light that would travel across centuries. That is how the myth began. Not through intention, not through grand declarations, but through the quiet accumulation of stories told in soft voices, each carrying a piece of the man who had taught a city to look inward, to question gently, and to live with the courage of an honest heart. In the years that followed, as the dust of Socrates' trial settled into the crevices of the city's memory, and the urgency of political life resumed its familiar rhythm, Athens began, slowly, hesitantly, almost unconsciously, to return to the ordinary movements of existence. Markets filled again with the calls of merchants. Fishermen returned to the scent of the sea and the endless repetition of pulling nets from the water. Children raced through the colonnades, their laughter echoing against the marble as though the city had never known sorrow. Yet something subtle had changed, something that did not reshape the outward appearance of Athens, but quietly redefined the deeper currents beneath its daily life. It was not a transformation that could be seen in any single moment or identified by any particular event. Rather, it lived within the small corners of thought, in the softened judgments of elders, in the growing patience of teachers, in the quiet moments when citizens found themselves pausing mid-sentence, mid-action, mid-breath, remembering the man who once asked them to examine why they believed what they believed. Even as new generations grew and old ones faded into the earth, the presence of Socrates lingered like a second light in the city, dim at times, barely perceptible, yet undeniably present, as though woven into the quiet fabric of Athens itself. For those who had known him intimately, Plato, Crito, Simmias, Cebes, and the others, the years that followed were marked by a strange duality. Life continued in its familiar rhythms, yet each step felt accompanied by the soft echo of Socrates' voice. Plato, especially, carried him like a hidden flame inside his chest, a steady warmth that guided his thoughts even in moments when he felt lost or uncertain. He wrote dialogues that captured not only the structure of Socrates' arguments, but the quality of his presence, the gentleness, the humor, the curiosity, the unshakable devotion to truth. Each time he put stylus to wax, he felt the quiet pressure of responsibility, knowing that the memory of Socrates now rested partly in his hands, not as a burden, but as a final gift from the man who had shaped his mind. Through these writings, Socrates' voice began to slip beyond the boundaries of Athens, carried in scrolls that traveled to other cities and other minds, planting seeds of inquiry in places he had never walked. Meanwhile, the companions who lacked Plato's gift for writing honored Socrates in quieter ways. Crito lived the remainder of his life with a tenderness that seemed to expand after Socrates' death, treating those around him with a gentleness that reflected the calm dignity of their final conversation. Simmias and Cebes continued to ponder the questions Socrates had left them, meeting beneath the same olive trees, allowing their reflections to deepen as years rolled onward. Even Apollodorus, whose tears had once flowed so freely, found in time that the intensity of his grief softened into a gentler devotion, a quiet remembrance that accompanied him like a shadow. They all carried Socrates differently, but each felt in his own way that the philosopher had not vanished entirely. He had simply shifted into a form that lived through them, in their choices, in their doubts, in their search for lives rooted in clarity and care for the soul. Athens itself, so quick to judge, so quick to move forward, could not entirely escape the lingering imprint of Socrates' life and death. Though many citizens tried to let the memory fade, to fold it neatly into the safe corners of history, certain moments brought it back with unexpected force. A debate that grew heated, only to pause as someone recalled Socrates' insistence on calm questioning. A dispute between neighbors softened by the memory that wisdom grows from humility. A young man hesitating before mocking a beggar or disdaining a craftsman, remembering that Socrates had valued the thoughts of all people equally. These small, nearly invisible shifts were not dramatic enough to change the course of Athens overnight. yet they accumulated quietly over the years, shaping the moral texture of the city in subtle but enduring ways. And so, though Athens had condemned him, it also carried him, unwillingly at first, then gradually with a kind of reflective respect. Beyond the borders of the city, the story of Socrates began to settle into the broader world, like a gentle wind spreading seeds across distant fields. Travelers carried tales of his calmness, his questions, his final moments. Scholars in other cities read Plato's dialogues, puzzled by the simplicity of Socrates' words, yet stirred by the depth of his thought. Some mocked him, some admired him, many misunderstood him, but none remained entirely untouched. Over time, the name Socrates began to represent something larger than the man, a symbol of inquiry, of humility, of the courage to live in alignment with one's principles. This transformation did not erase the real Socrates, the barefoot philosopher, the curious companion of craftsmen and youths. But it placed him within a wider story, a story about the human search for truth that stretched far beyond the narrow days of his life. Years turned into decades, and decades into centuries. The physical traces of Socrates' presence faded. The prison where he died crumbled into dust. The marketplace where he questioned Athenians changed with the flow of time. The olive trees beneath which he once spoke fell and were replaced by new ones whose leaves knew nothing of him. Yet the essence of his life, his calm courage, his unwavering devotion to questioning, his gentle acceptance of death, remained alive in the writings that had been shaped by those who loved him, in the memories passed through countless generations, in the quiet recognition that grew in the hearts of those who encountered his story. He became, in a sense, a companion not only to his friends, but to anyone who dared to ask why, anyone who paused in the midst of life's distractions to reflect on the nature of virtue, justice, or the soul. And now, as the centuries have stretched outward like long shadows cast by the setting sun, the quiet legacy of Socrates continues to breathe in the thoughts of people who never knew his voice, never saw his walk through the agora, never witnessed the calmness with which he accepted his fate. They meet him, not in person, but in words. Words carried through time, words preserved by those who refused to let his life vanish. And in these words, Socrates remains strangely alive, stepping through the boundaries of time as gently as he once stepped through the streets of Athens, asking questions that still stir the human heart. Perhaps this is the quiet ending of his story. Not the death in the cell, not the sorrow of his companions, not the echo of his trial, but the slow realization that a life lived with honesty does not end when the body grows still. It continues, softly, invisibly, like the lingering warmth of a flame after the wick has burned away. Socrates lives now not in statues or monuments, but in the quiet courage of those who dare to question themselves, in the humility of those who admit their own ignorance, in the calm strength of those who choose truth over comfort. A quiet ending, yes, but not a final one.